The wind swept low over the battlements of Winterfell, carrying with it the weight of old ghosts and unspoken yearnings. Robb Stark stood upon the ramparts, wrapped in a heavy cloak of wolfskin, his fiery hair stirring gently in the chill. He gazed out across the courtyard, where the hush of twilight had begun to settle over stone and snow. The great hall's torches flickered beneath, sending ribbons of orange light skipping across the cobblestones. In that fragile hour between day and night, all seemed still, as though the north were holding its breath, awaiting some quiet wonder or creeping doom. Robb's gloved hand rested on the cold stone merlon before him. He could sense the restlessness of his men gathering beyond the walls, camp spread out in neat lines of tent and mud dot. Winter would soon fall in earnest, and though he was the king in the north, he felt the weight of that crown settle heavier with each passing dusk. He had long since learned that kingship was not about pageantry or the glitter of gold, but about endless trials and sacrifices. His father, Eddard Stark, had taught him the old ways. A ruler must know the land, its people, and judge truthfully, do what was right, even when it hurt. But there, upon Winterfell's ramparts, Robb was haunted by the memory of all that had happened since his father had marched south. The War of the Five Kings had raged with savage fury. Bloodshed, betrayal, shifting alliances. Robb had struggled to keep the North united, forging fragile bonds among bannermen who might have harbored grudges or petty rivalries. For it was only in their combined might that they could resist the Lannisters and any others who claimed the Iron Throne by force or guile. So far, the war had tested Robb's cunning and steel at every turn. He had known defeats and victories, but the weight of losses had cut deeply, especially the sorrow of Talisa's death, of Grey Wind's fall, and of his mother's final screams at the twins. History might paint him as a tragic young wolf, undone by honor and the cruelty of men. But fate had something different in store. From the moment whispers reached the north that Daenerys Targaryen had returned to Westeros with dragons, the realm stirred with a mixture of awe, dread, and fascination. For so long, dragons were legends, ephemeral beasts from a bygone era. Now living flames soared across the seas, unstoppable and fearsome. Many in the north refused to believe it at first. Others grew anxious, wondering if these monstrous creatures would bring fire and ruin to their homes. Robb had only half believed the reports until the day ravens arrived bearing urgent tidings. One of Daenerys' dragons had been separated during a skirmish with Euron Greyjoy's fleet. Rhaegal, the green-scaled serpent rumored to glimmer with an emerald sheen, had been wounded and supposedly flown northward, out of sight. And then, nothing. For weeks, nobody could confirm its fate. The arrival of a single traveler from the Riverlands changed everything. A man named Jaren, half-starved, battered by outlaws, arrived at Winterfell's gates in the dead of night. Robb himself came out to see who pounded on the gates so desperately after the castle's curfew. The man gasped with wide eyes, stammering through chattering teeth, that he had seen a dragon in the deep forests near a narrow pass in the western hills. He described it in trembling detail. The swirling green of its scales, how it roared, wounded from some great battle. Days later, a scout party was assembled to investigate, uncertain if this was rumor or madness. The notion that such a beast might be wandering the north, injured and alone, gripped Robb's mind with urgent fascination. What if the tales were true? What if the north harbored not just armies of men, but a living dragon? He did not embark upon the expedition himself at first. He was too deeply mired in matters of war councils, provisioning for winter, and the precarious alliances among the riverlords who had once bent the knee to him. Yet the memory of the traveler's story gnawed at his thoughts, refusing to fade. Even Grey Wind's memory stirred in him a longing for another bond, one that went beyond the usual loyalty between man and beast. The Stark children had long known the uncanny closeness with their direwolves, but those beloved beasts had been taken from them one by one. The prospect of a dragon lurking among the pines felt like an echo of that lost magic, something immeasurably more potent and dangerous. Over the next weeks, a handful of riders returned from the wilds, claiming they had indeed glimpsed something monstrous, moving in the half-light between snowy crags. There were claw marks on trees 3 men high, the stench of sulfur and singed bark. But no living soul had managed to approach. Finally, with the war still poised precariously, with Tywin Lannister's armies rumored to be regrouping near Harrenhal, Robb found reason to slip away for a short journey. He masked it as an inspection of western watchtowers, took with him a small contingent of trusted soldiers, and set forth on the old roads leading into the stony hills. For the better part of a week, the group followed the faintest of tracks left behind by watchers who insisted the dragon was real. Day after day of damp, endless forests, the trunks dark as pitch, the wind moaning through the canopy. Each night they camped under low-hanging branches or in half-collapsed huts, listening for any sign of something monstrous in the sky. Their hearts pounded with a mixture of fear and strange hope, especially as they drew closer to the rumored lair. Robb felt that if he could glimpse this Rhaegal just once, something momentous might occur. Like the fleeting moment when a direwolf pup had chosen him back at the crossing of an old godswood. Or so he believed. The silent question burned in his heart. What would it mean for the war? For the North? It was on a morning of thin fog, when the sun was no more than a pale ghost behind the clouds, that they found what had once been a clearing. The earth was scorched in a broad circle, black and ashy. The remains of a fallen pine lay scattered in jagged chunks. The acrid odor of burnt needles and bark clung to the damp air, and the men coughed, eyes watering, as though the ground still smoldered with the aftermath of some hidden fire. Robb moved carefully through the blackened clearing, boots sinking into the spongy ash. In the center, beneath the twisted trunk of a massive pine that had been half ripped from the earth, a shallow cavity lay open. Animal bones, charred, some gnawed, were scattered among the debris. It was a monstrous sight, conjuring images of some great beast's feeding ground. To stumble upon it in near silence only heightened a sense that something enormous lurked close by. An uneasy hush fell over the company. One of the men whispered that they should turn back, that dragons were the stuff of Targaryens, not Starks, and that no good could come of meddling in these nightmares. Robb hushed him gently, unable to turn away. He ventured deeper, scanning the edges of the clearing with keen, wolfish eyes, until he caught sight of a dark silhouette crouched beneath a rocky overhang. For a moment, the shape was so still, he wondered if it might be the shadows playing tricks. Then it moved, so large that the motion sent a shiver through the branches overhead. The men behind Robb gasped in raw terror. There it was, emerald wings folded tight, shining with an otherworldly luster in the filtering dawnlight. The dragon, wounded, perhaps. Its chest rose and fell in labored breaths, and the faint hissing rumble it emitted made Robb's skin prickle. Rhaegal's great head turned slowly, pale eyes reflecting the fleeting sunlight, and Robb found himself locked in the unsettling, enthralling gaze of a creature older than men's memory. All the stories from Old Nan about dragons and their cruelty, their intelligence, their primal fury, flashed through his mind like a swirl of raven wings. And yet, he saw a spark in that eye. Not just savage hunger, but a wounded pride. A regal bearing that reminded him of a wounded direwolf standing steadfast despite its injuries. For a long moment, neither man nor dragon moved. Robb felt his heart thunder in his chest, and in that single heartbeat, he realized he was the only one who had not flinched backward or scrambled for a sword. He could feel an unspoken connection settle over them. He was the young wolf. This was a beast of old Valyria, a child of fire. Their lineages could not be more different, yet shared something in that realm of primal spirit. A bond to magic, perhaps, or simply to survival in a brutal world. Cautiously, Robb raised his hands, palms out, to show he carried no immediate threat. The dragon hissed softly, flicked the barbed tip of its tail, and shifted its injured flank into the light. A deep gash ran along its side, possibly from a ballista bolt or the cruel iron of Greyjoy scorpions. The wound was crusted with dark red scales of half-dried blood. Robb inhaled slowly, pity stirring in his chest at the sight. This was no invincible monster. It bled as any living creature did. Moving inch by inch, he stepped closer, keeping his hand extended, speaking in hushed tones that wove together old words he had used to calm gray wind, or the restless horses in Winterfell stables. He sensed that a single wrong move might prompt a burst of flame or a fatal slash of claws. But something urged him forward. Perhaps it was the memory of the traveler's frightened sincerity, or an instinct that if he turned away, he would never have another chance to shape the destiny of the war. His men stood behind him, too startled to shout. One of them whispered, "My lord, the beast will roast you alive. Please." Another prepared to draw a bow, but Robb lifted a quelling hand. He kept his voice low, steady. The dragon's breath sounded like crackling embers, each exhalation carrying a faint smokiness. Up close, the creature's eyes were not only pale, but shot through with threads of gold, swirling like molten metal. Robb felt them upon him, a presence that reached into something raw, ancient, and primal. He recalled all the tales of Aegon the Conqueror, of old Valyria, and the Targaryen words, fire and blood. But here and now, he could sense the dragon was in pain and alone. Carefully, Robb slid off his glove. The chill stung his fingers, but he set it aside, letting the warmth of his own skin face the creature. He spoke softly, voice trembling with awe. "Easy now. I'm not here to harm you." How the dragon understood was beyond Robb's guessing, but something in his tone or posture must have conveyed sincerity. A low rumble answered him, resonating in the pit of his stomach. He thought he felt a wave of heat emanate from the dragon's scaled chest, as though the burning furnace within was stoked by every breath. Then Rhaegal's neck curved slowly, bringing that enormous scarred head closer. Robb's men uttered a stifled cry. Sure, this was the end. But Robb held still, eyes wide. He felt warm breath upon him, smelled the smoky reek of brimstone. The dragon's nostrils flared, almost a curious sniff of the air around Robb's face and hand. And then, as if satisfied, it withdrew slightly, letting out a sound that was more like a groan than a roar, its chest rippling with pain. Gently, Robb reached out to the torn hide near the wound, as if to indicate he saw the source of suffering. In all his life, he had never felt anything like those scales, smooth as polished stone in some places, rough as gritty rock in others. Once he realized he could touch the creature without being blasted by dragonfire, relief and disbelief flooded Robb. The North was a harsh land, but also a realm of deeper magic. And in that moment, Robb Stark understood that their fates had become tangled. If the gods had indeed led him here to find a wounded dragon that might choose to trust him, it was something beyond mortal design. It had the feel of an omen, both wondrous and terrifying. Caring for a wounded dragon was no small feat. Robb's men believed he was mad, but they dared not abandon him. They tended to Rhaegal's injury as best they could, washing the gash with clean water from a nearby stream, using every scrap of healing knowledge gleaned from Maester Luwin's old lessons. The dragon tolerated some of their ministrations, though it often snarled, and each time that fiery exhalation heated the air, the men scrambled to keep their distance. It took them 2 days to do what little they could: clean the wound, pack it with a poultice of herbs that northern wise women used for dire wolves and horses alike, and wrap it in linen bandages in a haphazard manner. The entire time, Rhaegal watched Robb's every movement, as though waiting to see if the humans would harm or help. Meanwhile, Robb spoke to it softly, reciting passages of the old gods, telling stories about the North, about Grey Wind, about his father and mother, and about why he fought this war. He didn't know if the dragon understood a word, but in the hush of the forest, it felt like the beginnings of a fragile bond. Rhaegal endured, though not meekly, and by the end of the second day, it seemed to have regained some measure of strength. Occasionally, it tested its wings, making the canopy overhead roar with sudden wind. The men cowered in alarm, certain they would be devoured. But Robb would murmur his gentle hushes, approach slowly, and lay a hand on Rhaegal's flank to calm the creature. Bit by bit, a certain trust formed. Only then did Robb consider what it would mean to bring a dragon back to Winterfell. The practicality of it made him grimace. Where would it stay? How would they feed it? What would happen if it scorched half the courtyard? But a deeper, strategic voice inside him, realized that a dragon could be a mighty deterrent to the Lannisters. If he could somehow secure Rhaegal's cooperation, the war would change drastically. The notion felt impossible, like a fantasy. Yet there he stood, bandaging an ancient beast, and it had not made him its dinner. The journey home was far from simple. Rhaegal could walk, albeit slowly, lumbering on powerful hind legs, using its wings like awkward forelimbs at times. It disdained the presence of Robb's men but tolerated them when Robb led the beast onward. Night after night, they camped in secluded glens, always mindful that any sign of the dragon's presence might draw unwanted eyes or provoke local villagers to panic. One evening, the dragon vanished into the tree line to hunt, returning at dawn with fresh kill, some manner of great elk, half burned by a gout of flame. The men eyed the sizzling remains with pale faces, but Robb only steeled himself. This was the nature of the creature, after all. They pressed onward, skirting villages and old keeps, avoiding main roads, until at last the walls of Winterfell rose in the distance like a sentinel of stone. Word spread through the castle with the swiftness of ravens. The king in the north was approaching with a dragon in tow. Pure disbelief simmered among the small folk, among the guards, among the old men who remembered tales of Aegon's conquest. But soon everyone with eyes to see beheld the living marvel, a green draconic shape that lumbered in the distance, occasionally lifting its huge wings in an impatient flap. The courtyard was in uproar when Robb finally came through the gates with his loyal guard, a monstrous silhouette following. No one knew whether to shout, flee, or mount a defense. Maester Luwin had died years past, but his successor, Maester Conran, watched from a distance with the ashen face of a man witnessing the impossible. The lords who were present, mostly minor houses, as many of the great lords were still in the field, gathered around, stunned. Soldiers hurried to brandish spears and bows, though they wavered in confusion, glancing at Robb for guidance. And standing in the middle of it all, with Rhaegal by his side, Robb Stark lifted a hand and bid them hold. No one spoke for several moments, as the dragon let out a low growl that rumbled through the stones beneath their feet. Then Robb turned to the assembly, his voice carrying with a quiet authority. "Lower your weapons," he said, though his own heart pounded with the memory of flame. "He has come under my protection. Treat him as you would a dire wolf of House Stark." Murmurs rolled through the crowd. One of the older knights sputtered, "But your grace, it's a dragon. It's dangerous." Robb met his gaze, unwavering. "So are we, when threatened. For now, he is wounded, and I've seen to it he'll heal. If any man here raises a blade against him, they will answer for it." The hush that followed was thick with tension. Then slowly, the soldiers and the watchers lowered their weapons. In that moment, the line between fear and wonder blurred in the eyes of everyone present. Bringing Rhaegal into Winterfell's courtyard posed 1,000 logistical challenges. They could not exactly stable him with the horses. In the end, Robb had the beast guided to a broad clearing near the outer walls, where the old training yard adjoined a half-ruined tower that had collapsed during Theon's occupation years before. There, Rhaegal settled on a makeshift bed of straw, fresh hides, and warmed bricks, with an open sky overhead. Robb assigned a small retinue of men to keep watch. Men he trusted not to provoke the dragon or take a drunken notion to test its might. The presence of a living dragon in the heart of Winterfell felt like an impossible dream. Some said it was an abomination, a portent of ill fortune. Others said it was the greatest stroke of luck the North had seen in centuries, if harnessed wisely. And so the days passed in an uneasy dance. Food had to be procured. Large game, sides of beef from the butchers, entire goats. Rhaegal devoured them with savage appetite, always leaving scorched remains. Robb, for his part, spent time near the dragon daily, seeing to its bandages, speaking softly, letting the creature grow accustomed to his presence. Bit by bit, Rhaegal healed. Its breathing steadied, its movements grew less labored. When it stretched its wings, the powerful membranes rustled, sending leaves and dust swirling. Occasionally, it would release a roar so thunderous that the windows of the great keep shook, and people in the nearest villages cowered in their homes. Still, no matter the thunder or the roar, Rhaegal seemed to regard Robb as something akin to a caretaker. Perhaps not a rider, but a figure the dragon accepted. Over time, the curious notion of mounting the beast found its way into Robb's thoughts. He had never heard of a Stark riding a dragon, nor even any man beyond the Targaryens. Yet if the dragon recognized him, if it allowed him close enough to run his hand along the scaled neck or feed it from his own palm, perhaps the old stories of Valyrian bloodlines were not the only path to forging a connection. Perhaps the old magic of the North, the bond with direwolves, might overlap with the bond between man and dragon. A mad fancy, some would call it. But as the days wore on, the possibility kept him awake long into the night. In the midst of this wonder, the war continued to loom. Ravens from the south told of Tywin Lannister rallying a large host, as cunning as ever, biding his time while the other claimants, Stannis, the remnants of Renly's alliance, the Ironborn, were distracted by their own strife. Tywin was amassing gold, forging new alliances. No matter how many times the young wolf had defeated Lannister armies in the field, the cunning lion found a way to endure. And if Tywin marched north with a mighty host, the North would once again be forced to fight on home ground, with winter at their doorstep. It would be a brutal campaign. Robb prayed the capture of Harrenhal by his allies would slow Tywin, but rumors suggested that the Lannister supply lines were well supported from the gold mines to the west. Already, small skirmishes had erupted along the borders of the Riverlands. Each day that Rhaegal rested in Winterfell was another day Tywin advanced. Sansa, returned from the Eyrie to give what counsel she could to her brother, walked with Robb in the Godswood one frost-laced morning. The slender weirwood branches overhead were barren now, carved faces weeping red sap that dropped into the thin snow. She asked softly if the rumors of a dragon at Winterfell were true. When Robb explained the whole story, she stared at him as though torn between awe and alarm. "Could it really help us?" she asked. "Could a dragon turn the tide of the war?" Robb turned his gaze to the face of the heart tree. Solemn. "It might, but the risk is also great. If it goes berserk, if it sets half our forces aflame, we'd be no better off. And if it draws the ire of every house in the south, we might find ourselves at war with more than just Lannisters." Sansa nodded, her breath plumbing in the cold air. "Perhaps," she said, "but better to have that might on our side than to face it as an enemy. The realm already fears dragons. Imagine how they'd tremble to see the young wolf on one's back." That thought lingered, taking hold of Robb's imagination. Could he ride the dragon? Men from across the realm had come to see it, though they maintained a fearful distance, each one spinning their own theories on how the Targaryens alone could master such beasts. Yet Robb knew in his bones that Rhaegal was no mindless monster. He was a proud, wounded creature that recognized Robb as the one who had saved it. Perhaps that strange trust was enough to attempt something extraordinary. For days, Robb visited the dragon, speaking in calm tones, running his hands along the creature's flank. Sometimes Rhaegal would rumble contentedly, or what Robb interpreted as contentment. Other times, the dragon would tense, letting out a growl that made the watchers on the walls shift nervously. But never did it lash out in unprovoked aggression. The day Robb decided to see if it would bear him, he made certain no one else was in the courtyard. If he died in a burst of flame, let it be only his life on the line. Morning sunlight slanted across the stones, revealing the battered tower's broken silhouette. Rhaegal was curled near a brazier, an attempt by the stable hands to keep the creature warm, though it hardly needed it. The dragon was dozing, the steady rise and fall of its chest a rhythmic lull. Robb approached slowly, his boots echoing on the cobblestones. The dragon's bright eyes flicked open, and Robb felt that same primal jolt in his chest. He murmured a greeting, letting his voice wash over the silence. Step by step, he closed the distance, reaching out to place a hand on Rhaegal's shoulder. The scales felt warmer than usual, as though the creature had stoked its inner fire in sleep. He rubbed softly, feeling the ridges beneath his palm. Rhaegal's eyes half-lidded, an expression that might have been acceptance. Heart pounding, Robb moved alongside the beast, searching for how he might climb without causing offense or injury. Rhaegal shifted, perhaps sensing Robb's intention, and extended one wing to touch the ground, forming a sort of ramp. Robb's breath caught. Could it be so simple? He placed one foot on a sturdy joint of that wing, then another, pulling himself upward. The emerald membrane stretched beneath him, thick as leather but smooth to the touch. He could feel the dragon's muscles tense with each movement. Yet there was no roar, no snap of jaws. Carefully, as though mounting a great warhorse, Robb eased himself onto the broad ridge between Rhaegal's neck and shoulders. He held onto a row of spiny protrusions for support. For a moment, both man and dragon froze, uncertain. Then, Rhaegal let out a low, deep rumble that vibrated through Robb's entire body. It was not a rejection. If anything, it felt like acceptance. Robb let out a shaky laugh, the sound cracking in the cold morning air. He was perched on the back of a dragon. Everything felt surreal. The vantage point, the shift of muscles beneath him, the warm exhalations. And though he had mounted many steeds, none possessed the raw, elemental power he felt coursing through Rhaegal. If he could master this bond, if Rhaegal would let him guide flight. The notion filled him with heady exhilaration, but the moment did not last long. Rhaegal stirred, lifting its head as though testing the air. Then, with a sudden heave, it rose onto its hind legs, wings spreading outward. Robb clung with all his strength, feeling gravity tear at him. The rush of adrenaline that followed made his ears ring. Rhaegal roared, a great billowing cry that shook the very walls of Winterfell, and then slammed its forelegs down onto the cobblestones. The shock rattled the ground. Robb lost his grip, tumbling from the dragon's back onto the stones. He hit hard, pain jolting up his side. Dazed, he looked up at Rhaegal, bracing for a gout of flame. But the dragon simply turned its head toward him, gave a snort, and huffed a small burst of smoke from its nostrils, as if amused by Robb's clumsy fall. Robb, wincing, managed a grin despite the pain. "All right," he said, catching his breath. "We'll try again tomorrow, if that pleases you." The dragon lowered its head slightly, its gaze unwavering, and Robb could have sworn he saw a spark of humor in that molten eye. The attempts continued in secret. Each day, Robb would try to mount Rhaegal again, practicing how to shift his weight, how to hold onto the ridges without hurting either the dragon or himself. He fashioned a sort of harness from leather straps, though the idea of controlling Rhaegal with reins seemed laughable. Mostly, it was something to brace himself if the creature took flight. Sometimes Rhaegal let him mount easily. Other times the beast would shrug him off or roar with enough force that Robb tumbled back, winded. But each night, the two parted without violence, and that alone was progress. Then, at last, the day came when Rhaegal spread its wings wide, gave Robb only the barest warning, an alert flick of the tail, and launched itself into the air with an explosion of power. Robb's mind blanked with terror and thrill. The courtyard fell away in a rush, the walls shrinking as Rhaegal surged upward, great green wings beating the air in resounding blasts. He was airborne, clinging to the dragon's back, wind screaming against his face, eyes watering in the frigid air. A frantic, exulted laugh tore from his throat. Below, Winterfell's towers seemed like toy blocks, its parapets lined with tiny figures pointing upward. Rhaegal's shadows flicked across the rooftops as the beast soared in a wide arc over the castle, as if testing the strength of its wings for the first time since its injury. Robb felt weightless, a knot of fear and triumph roiling in his stomach. The exhilaration was unlike anything he had known, 1,000 times more potent than leading a cavalry charge, or riding full tilt across the plains. This was the sky. This was freedom. The flight did not last long. Rhaegal, still recovering, seemed to tire quickly. After a brief circle around the castle towers, the dragon descended awkwardly, landing hard in the courtyard. Robb nearly pitched off from the impact but managed to keep his seat. A swirl of dust and grit flew up around them. For a moment, no one dared speak. Then the watchers on the walls erupted in startled cheers, and one guard started shouting, "The king rides a dragon! The king rides a dragon!" Robb slid from the creature's back, breath ragged, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He put a hand on Rhaegal's neck, feeling the powerful muscles quiver with exhaustion. Then, scarcely believing, he lowered his head in gratitude. His men rushed forward, eyes aflame with wonder and awe. "Your Grace," they muttered. "By the gods." News spread like wildfire. Soon, the entire north knew that Robb Stark had flown above Winterfell on a dragon's back. Some called him the Winged Wolf. Others whispered that this was an omen that the Targaryen claim was overshadowed, as if the old gods had chosen Robb. Wild rumors spread to the south as well. That Robb Stark had stolen a Targaryen dragon, that he was forging alliances with monsters, that he was forging a path to become the next Aegon. Each day, ravens arrived from his allies, some uncertain, some elated, some begging for a demonstration of this rumored power. And Tywin Lannister, if half the rumors were true, would have every reason to tremble. For while a dragon does not make an army, it changes everything about how battles are fought. Still, Robb was not lulled into complacency. He knew that if Tywin marched north, the presence of one dragon would not automatically guarantee victory if the lion's host was vast enough, cunning enough, armed with siege weapons that might pierce dragon scales. But it was a hope, a symbol, that the north had the strength of legend on its side. The question became how to use it. He could not simply destroy Tywin's armies from the sky, not unless Rhaegal's relationship with him proved strong enough to sustain full combat. Was the dragon truly loyal? Or simply abiding Robb's presence out of convenience and memory of kindness? The difference would decide the fate of thousands of men on the battlefield. Tywin Lannister's machinations soon forced Robb's hand. Reports came in of Lannister forces moving stealthily through the Riverlands, crossing at the Red Fork, capturing small forts, burning loyalist villages. Word had it that Tywin intended to lure the young wolf south, away from the safety of Winterfell, away from the dread presence of the dragon, and into a trap. But Robb had learned from his mistakes. He summoned his bannermen, called upon the old lords who had stood with him at the outset of the war. The Greyjoy roared with excitement at the mention of the dragon. Roose Bolton's envoys offered measured words, but one could never be sure of the Boltons' loyalty. The Karstarks, newly reconciled after old wounds, promised swords. House Manderley, House Glover, House Serwyn, House Reed, all answered. They gathered in Winterfell's hall, beneath the watchful eyes of direwolf banners and flickering torches. It was a smaller force than in the height of the war, for the north had been bled, but it was a fearsome force, hardened by winters and betrayal. Robb stood at the high table, the memory of flight still fresh in his mind. He did not speak of the dragon as an instant victory. Instead, he spoke of duty, of protecting the north from the cruelty of House Lannister, which had cost them so many good men and women. He told them that with the dragon, they had a chance to strike fear into Tywin's heart, to break his lines before he could entrench himself. The lords banged their cups in agreement, or in careful acceptance, each of them eyeing the possibility of a new type of warfare. The meeting ended with a plan. Robb would march with half the host, using Rhaegal in strategic strikes to disrupt supply lines and sow confusion, while the other half remained in the north to guard against any cunning feint Tywin might attempt. So it came to pass that the young wolf once again rode from Winterfell, though this time not as a king in a simple war camp, but astride a wounded healing dragon whose beating wings stirred the snow into whirling storms whenever it launched into the sky. Alongside him rode his loyal bannermen, their direwolf standards snapping in the wind. The people of Winterfell lined the battlements to watch them go, uncertain if they would return victorious or battered by southern cunning. Many whispered prayers to the old gods, or the Seven, or any deity they thought might show mercy. The march south was slow at first. Rhaegal could not fly long distances without tiring, forcing Robb to keep pace with the ground forces. Still, each time the dragon took to the sky, it scouted the terrain ahead, returning with roars that shook men's hearts. One afternoon, they encountered a small Lannister scouting party near an abandoned watchtower. Robb allowed the dragon a show of force, unleashing a spout of greenish flame that instantly scattered the enemy, turning half of them to cinders. The survivors fled in blind panic, their screams carrying news of a dragon's wrath. Robb's men felt their spirits surge at the sight. The power was indescribable. Yet Robb only stared at the blackened remains with grim eyes, recognizing that war was savage, no matter the weapon. Fire and blood were Targaryen words, but now they lingered around him like a dark halo. As they pressed deeper into the Riverlands, the land bore scars of old battles. Villages burned out, crops left to rot. The people were weary, as if they had lived a dozen wars in the span of a few years. Robb ordered his men to pay for supplies fairly where they could, to treat the small folk with mercy and kindness. He promised them that once this war was done, the North would not forget its duty to help rebuild. Some of the villagers eyed the dragon with terror, others with a sort of desperate hope, as if maybe this monstrous force could end their misery. They told stories of how Tywin's foragers swept through, taking what they wished, burning what they couldn't carry. Late one evening, Robb camped with his army on the edge of a ruined orchard near a meandering river. He stood alone by Rhaegal, stroking the dragon's flank, feeling the slow, steady breaths against the fading light. The beast's wound had largely mended, though a raw scar remained where the bolt had torn through scales. If he looked closely, Robb could still see a faint shudder of discomfort when Rhaegal stretched that side. Each day, the dragon's flight grew stronger, longer. In the hush of twilight, Robb leaned his head against the warm scales, the way he once did with Grey Wind, and closed his eyes. All the burdens of war, the memory of the Red Wedding, the longing for his mother, father, and siblings weighed upon him. When he exhaled, it was like a prayer. In that silent communion, he felt the stirring of Rhaegal's draconic spirit. Ferocious, proud, but bound to him by something intangible. A soft voice startled him. "Your Grace." It was one of his captains, a middle-aged man with a weathered face. "We've had a messenger. A rider from Lord Edmure Tully. He says Tywin's main host is advancing along the northern marches of the Riverlands, pushing east. He begs for your aid before Riverrun is encircled." Robb opened his eyes, his sense of peace shattered by the reality of war. "How far are they?" The captain hesitated. "A few days' march, perhaps less. From what we gather, Edmure's men hold the fords, but Tywin's force outnumbers him. If we don't intervene..." Robb nodded, his gaze turning to the dancing reflection of the campfires in Rhaegal's eye. "We march at first light," he said, voice low. "Tywin wants to trap us or draw us out. We'll see how he fares when the sky rains fire." "Then," he swore. Thus, the final approach to the confrontation with Tywin Lannister began. The nights were tense, the men aware that they were heading into a defining moment in the war. Robb tried to keep morale high, reminding them that the North had triumphed before, that they had cunning and skill. Yet all knew this time was different. They did not merely field steel and valor, but the might of an emerald dragon whose roars echoed in the gloom. Scouts reported that Tywin was methodical, constructing a chain of fortified positions, preparing for a pitched battle near a broad plain just south of the Red Fort. The land there was open and relatively flat, perfect for cavalry, but also dangerously exposed if the enemy had archers and siege engines. It was also a place where a dragon might unleash devastating flame across entire ranks. Robb's heart pounded each time he pictured the columns of men arrayed in shining armor, the banners of House Lannister, the gold and crimson fluttering in the wind, Tywin's pitiless eyes gleaming beneath a black helm. 2 days later, at dawn, the armies of the North and the Lannisters stood across from one another on a wide field ringed by patchy woodland. Thick clouds obscured the sun, casting a dreary light over the assembled thousands. Robb's host, some 15,000 strong, formed into ranks of spearmen, archers, knights, and men-at-arms. Their banners displayed the direwolf of Stark, the roaring bear of Mormont, the mailed fist of Glover, the sunburst of Karstark, the trident of Tully. They advanced behind the rolling mists of morning, their breath steaming in the chill. Across from them, the Lannister lines were formidable. Footmen arrayed in disciplined blocks, crossbows glinting, cavalry ready to charge, siege weapons bristling behind their lines. The air crackled with tension, the horses stamping and snorting as if they too sensed the friction of destiny in the wind. Tywin Lannister himself was rumored to be leading from a vantage near the center. His war council included Kevin Lannister, some Frey allies, and mercenary captains. They believed they faced the young wolf, known for battlefield cunning. But none could have been fully prepared for the presence of a dragon. Not until a roar tore open the sky. Rhaegal's silhouette appeared against the clouds, swooping low over the northern lines. The men let out a ragged cheer, half exultation, half terror. Even from a distance, one could see the Lannister ranks sway in shock. The next moments held the hush of an oncoming storm, as though the entire realm paused to witness whether the old magic of dragons could turn the tide. Robb Stark sat astride Rhaegal, harness strapped firmly around his waist and chest, his hand clinging to a ridged spine. He could taste the cold wind, smell the sweat of men and horses below, hear the thump of his own heart. His warhorse was kept in reserve behind his lines, in case he needed to dismount for any reason. But for now, he soared above, scanning the Lannister formations, the siege weapons angled upward. At last he spotted them. Great scorpions, ballista-like contraptions designed to hurl heavy bolts skyward. They were Tywin's insurance against a dragon attack. Robb's blood ran cold. The memory of Rhaegal's wound flickered. These weapons could be deadly if they found their mark. "We'll not make this simple for them," Robb whispered, voice whipped away by the wind. He guided Rhaegal in a sweeping arc, just out of range. A volley of bolts launched upward, but fell harmlessly short. Another roar shook the air as the beast exhaled scorching green flame, though they were too distant to do real damage. It was a show of power, testing the Lannister lines. Below, the infantry readied themselves, bracing shields, leveling spears. Robb flew over his own lines, and from that vantage, he signaled the buglers. They sounded the charge for the cavalry on the flanks. And so, the battle began in earnest. Men surging forward, horns blaring, the ground trembling under hooves and footfalls. Above it all, Rhaegal soared, a living tempest, waiting for the right moment to strike. Robb scanned for the scorpion positions, the greatest threat to his draconic ally. If they could neutralize those, the Lannister lines would be at his mercy. He felt Rhaegal's muscles tense beneath him, as though the dragon sensed the rising heat of battle. Metal clashed below. Screams and shouts resounded through the early morning gloom. Clouds of dust, churned by thousands of boots, drifted upward. Robb circled, hearing the hiss of wind, the heavy beat of wings, the pounding of his own pulse. Now, he thought, it begins. Yet he knew this was only the first strike of a confrontation that could reshape the realm. In that pause before diving, Robb recalled his father's words about mercy, about justice. He remembered the Red Wedding, the burning villages, the betrayal. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the memory of Grey Wind's death fuel his resolve. Then he opened them, steel in his gaze, and urged Rhaegal downward with a slight shift of his weight. A gentle pressure on the spines that told the dragon it was time for war. The beast answered with an earth-shaking roar, wings folding in for a dive. The Lannister scorpions turned their swiveling heads, frantically tracking the sudden plummet from the heavens. Robb held his breath, braced himself, and prepared to unleash the fury of a dragon upon the hosts of Tywin Lannister. The fate of the North, of his people, of everything he had fought for, balanced upon a knife's edge in that breathless moment of fire and flight. And so the story of the young wolf, astride Rhaegal, hurtled forward into the flames of battle, determined to carve a new chapter of legend, or perish in the attempt. Pa-a-ka. The dive was like plummeting through a storm cloud. Wind whipped past Robb's face, tugging at his hair and cloak, and every instinct clamored for him to flatten himself against Rhaegal's scaled back and hold fast. The dragon's wings curled tight to its body, emerald membranes thrumming with the tension of a coiled spring. Robb's heart hammered so fiercely that it felt ready to burst. Below, the earth rushed upward in a blur of brown fields, patches of churned mud, thousands of men in glinting armor. From above, they looked like toy soldiers hastily arranged. But he knew each tiny figure was a living soul, armed with spear, sword, or arrow, some wearing the red and gold lion of Lannister, others the proud, deary wolf of Stark. A roar tore free of Rhaegal's throat, ripping across the battlefield like thunder. Men gaped in terror. Some scrambled to flee, turning from their ranks, while others clenched spears or crossbows, hearts pounding in unison with the dragon's pulsing wings. Here and there, captains bellowed for their troops to hold steady, pointing frantically at the great scorpions arrayed along the Lannister flank. The siege crews rushed to angle the long iron-tipped bolts skyward, hoping to pierce the emerald fury that plummeted from the heavens. Robb braced for impact, leaning low as the first volley streaked upward in a jagged arc. Bolts whizzed past, trailing faint threads of smoke as they tore at the sky. One soared dangerously close to Rhaegal's flank. Robb felt the beast jerk sideways in midair, wings snapping open in a sudden flare that broke the speed of their descent. He saw the monstrous bolt streak by, missing them by mere feet. His stomach lurched. Then Rhaegal roared again, unleashing a storm of greenish fire that cascaded over the siege line. The flame poured across the ground in a sweeping crescent, incinerating men and wood alike, swirling into thick plumes of oily black smoke. Shrieks filled the air. Through the haze, Robb glimpsed scorpions engulfed in flames, their beams snapping as the metal fittings overheated, exploding in sparks. The men who worked them twisted and fell, some still gripping the levers, others trying to roll away while their clothes burned. Horror clashed with exhilaration inside Robb's mind. War had taught him to steel himself against violence, but watching men die by dragonfire was a savage, new dimension. He forced himself not to turn aside. This was no time for hesitation. If he allowed himself to crumble beneath pity, Tywin's cunning would doom them all. Rhaegal pulled up sharply, beating its wings with powerful thrusts to regain altitude. As they climbed, the dragon's chest heaved from the ferocity of the flame it had just breathed. Below, the Lannister line was in disarray. Smoke churned in thick clouds, and the stench of charred flesh and burning wood wafted upward, making Robb's eyes sting. One scorpion remained unscathed near the rear. He saw the siege crew hastily reloading, guided by an officer who shrieked orders above the din. Another volley soared. Rhaegal twisted in the air, a graceful pivot that nearly unseated Robb. He clung for dear life, feeling the muscles rippling beneath him. A bolt tore through the tip of Rhaegal's left wing, leaving a small jagged hole. The dragon shrieked in pain, a high-pitched wail that reverberated in Robb's bones. His arms trembled with the effort of staying astride. "Easy," he tried to shout, though his voice felt swallowed by the storm of chaos. Rhaegal snapped its tail in agony, releasing a spasm of flame from its jaws, though the scorpion crew was out of range. In that moment, Robb realized just how delicate their advantage was. One well-placed bolt, and Rhaegal might be gravely wounded or brought down altogether. He could not afford to let the Lannisters pick them out of the sky. Forcing calm, he leaned closer to the dragon's ear, as though his voice might reach it through the swirling mania. "We'll have to destroy that last scorpion," he murmured. "Come on, boy. Just once more." Rhaegal flapped harder, climbing toward a rolling bank of clouds. Robb squinted as the sun finally broke through in a fleeting ray, illuminating the carnage below with stark clarity. On the plain, the northern cavalry had crashed into the Lannister flank, using the confusion sown by the dragonfire to their advantage. War cries rang out, steel clashed on steel, and everywhere men struggled in a press of bodies. The cavalry charge had hammered a wedge into the Lannister line, but the Lion's soldiers were disciplined. They were regrouping, forming ranks of pikemen to repel the horses. Dust and blood mingled underfoot. Tywin's men fought with the desperation of cornered wolves, spurred on by the knowledge that a dragon circled overhead. Rhaegal let out a hiss, streaming smoke from its nostrils as it angled its path toward the scorpion. Robb saw the siege crew busily adjusting aim, now tracking them more carefully. His pulse pounded at the realization that they might not get another chance if the crew fired first. "Now," he said, shifting his weight, doing his best to guide the dragon's dive. The beast responded with a fierce cry, tipping into a sudden descent that made Robb's vision blur for a heartbeat. The ground rushed to meet them as the scorpion crew hurried to turn the heavy weapon. Robb caught a glimpse of the lead operator, a grizzled man with a savage expression. They had him in their sights. He heard a faint creaking as the scorpion's cord drew taut. There was no time to dodge. Rhaegal blasted out a sheet of flame, raw heat swirling across the weapon. The man and his crew disappeared in a furious blaze. A second later, the stored tension in the scorpion's mechanism snapped. The bolt launched blindly, trailing fire, whizzing off course by yards, before plunging into the dirt with a distant thud. Robb exhaled in shaky relief. The last scorpion was gone, reduced to a pile of twisted metal and cinders. But in that instant, Rhaegal's altitude was dangerously low, bringing them into range of the archers among the Lannister foot. Arrows hissed skyward. Most were wild shots, but one or two found the dragon's scales, bouncing off with little effect. Another lodged into the membrane of Rhaegal's already injured wing. The dragon roared again, furious, twisting in the air. Robb felt the jolt through his entire frame, his teeth rattling. Desperate to regain the sky, he tugged sharply at the leather straps he'd fashioned. No real bridle, but enough to signal the dragon to rise. Rhaegal obeyed, climbing fast, the roaring wind drowning out the clamor below. They soared beyond the immediate tangle of arrow fire, giving Robb a dizzying, horrific view of the battlefield. Smoke trailed from pockets of flame where Rhaegal's earlier blasts had set siege equipment ablaze. The northern cavalry wedge was now a swirling melee of men and horses, pikes and swords glinting in the half-light. On the left flank, archers from House Glover and House Reed unleashed volleys into the Lannister lines, while the Greatjon led a furious charge at the center. The field was a patchwork of color and gore. Scarlet splashes of blood, upturned earth, swirling dust. Robb searched for Tywin's command tent or any sign of the Lannister leadership. It must be somewhere near the center, behind the lines. If he could coordinate an attack on that position, the Lannisters might fold. But it was too chaotic to see clearly. He tugged once more on the strap, maneuvering Rhaegal eastward, where he knew his own standard-bearers were forming. He spotted them, the direwolf banner waving above a small knot of northern infantry. A few outriders from Robb's personal guard saw him descending and spurred their horses in his direction, clearing space among the carnage. One voice stood out, bellowing above the din, Lord Umber, the Greatjon, his booming tones recognizable even from the air. Robb's breath caught as Rhaegal swept down in a controlled landing, wings stirring up a furious gust that battered the men and rattled the fallen spears. The Greatjon shielded his face from the swirl of grit. Robb slid down from Rhaegal's back, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground, feeling his legs quake from strain and adrenaline. The chaos of the battlefield closed in around him. Screams, thunder of hooves, clang of metal. He could smell the iron tang of blood and the bitter smoke of burning wood. One of his bannermen sprang to steady him. He shot the man a quick nod of thanks, then turned to find the Greatjon, who was panting, his thick beard smeared with dust. "We're holding," boomed the Greatjon, his face streaked with sweat. "But the Lannisters aren't breaking yet. They're trying to regroup around the center. They've got lines of shield bearers protecting something. Maybe Tywin and his captains." Rhaegal behind them let out a throaty growl, glaring at a group of Lannister footmen, not far off, who threatened to advance. One of the footmen took one look at the dragon and promptly backed away, dragging an injured comrade with him. Robb's mind raced. He knew if Tywin was truly at the center, the best chance of scattering the Lannister command was a swift strike, either a cavalry charge or Rhaegal's flame. But the center was a thicket of pikes and archers, a bristling hedgehog that could cost them dearly if they just rushed in. He took a breath, trying to calm the wild pounding of his heart. "Greatjon, gather the cavalry to the eastern flank," Robb ordered, raising his voice over the cries of the wounded and the ring of steel. "Sweep around the perimeter. We'll hem them in. I'll coordinate with our archers to lay covering fire. Once we've pinned them, I'll bring the dragon from behind. That should push them into disarray." The Greatjon's eyes gleamed with the excitement of battle, though he nodded. They'll burn for what they've done." He stomped away, rallying some of Robb's personal guard with animated shouts. Robb turned to Rhaegal, whose sides still heaved from the exertion of flight and flame. Blood trickled from the wounds on its wing, nothing grievous. but enough that the dragon was clearly in pain. Robb laid a hand on the scaled flank. The hide radiated intense warmth, scorching enough that it nearly burned through Robb's gauntlet. "Easy," he murmured, stroking gently. He felt guilty for demanding so much from the creature. Yet the moment for mercy was not now, not with Tywin's host still poised to turn the tide if given a chance. Just a bit longer. He wondered if the dragon understood, or merely sensed his intentions. Rhaegal blinked slow, a rumble vibrating deep in its throat. Chaos continued across the field as various houses pressed their advantage. Carried by the impetus of the cavalry wedge, northern spearmen advanced steadily, forcing Lannister footmen back step by step. Bodies carpeted the soil, and the crows had already begun to circle overhead, drawn by the smell of carnage. Robb steeled himself against the horror and focused on his plan. If Tywin was among the Lannisters at the center, he might attempt a rally or a cunning flanking maneuver. Robb had fought too many battles to underestimate the old lion's sense of strategy. He called out to a nearby group of archers, men from House Glover, who were raining arrows on an enemy formation. "Focus your fire to the center," he shouted. "Cut down anyone who tries to reinforce that line." A captain gave a quick salute. Robb then dispatched 2 riders to the left flank, where Karstark spearmen were embroiled in a melee. They carried orders to peel away from the main clash and circle in behind the Lannister center, once it was pinned down by the cavalry. Meanwhile, Rhaegal tested its wings, letting out a hiss of discomfort. Robb cursed softly, glancing at the torn membrane. Each time the dragon moved the injured wing, fresh blood dripped, though the flow was slight. "You're strong enough," Robb told it, half entreaty, half command. "We just need one more flight, one more strike." He could see how Rhaegal's eyes flared in response, the luminous gold within those pupils unwavering. The bond they'd forged in the lonely northern forests still held, even in this sea of blood and steel. He climbed carefully back onto Rhaegal's back. This time the dragon's movements were slower, as though uncertain. Robb felt a wrench of sympathy, but he forced it down. If they did not strike now, Tywin might regroup, or even escape to fight another day. The last thing Robb wanted was to chase Lannisters through the Riverlands until winter's full onset doomed them all. Better to end it here, in a single crushing blow, if the gods were merciful. He settled into place, secured by the leather harness, and inhaled. "All right?" he said quietly, giving Rhaegal's neck a tentative pat. "Up." The dragon extended its wings, ignoring the pain. A gust of wind whirled around them, scattering dust and loose arrows. With a powerful kick, Rhaegal launched them into the air. Robb's stomach clenched as the ground dropped away in a swirl of shrieks and flashing steel. Soon they were aloft once more, though he felt Rhaegal's flight falter slightly, the wounded wing hampering a perfect ascent. Still, they managed to climb above arrow range, drifting on a strong crosswind that carried them over the southwestern part of the field. From this vantage, Robb spotted the eastern flank move into place, the Great John's cavalry forming up in a line of snorting horses. A second group, presumably under Bolton or Karstark banners, peeled away as instructed, curving around to flank the Lannister center. The red and gold lion standards fluttered near the heart of the enemy lines, a cluster of mounted knights and disciplined infantry who had reformed into a shield wall. Robb tried to pick out Tywin's distinctive silver-gold hair, or the proud crimson cloak he was said to wear in battle, but the swirl of men and dust made it difficult. He did, however, see a large canopy near the rear of that cluster, most likely the command position. He angled Rhaegal toward it, scanning the ground. The Lannisters must have realized what was coming. Archers scrambled to aim upward, though without scorpions, their prospects of hitting a high-flying dragon were dim. Still, an unlucky arrow could worsen Rhaegal's injury, so Robb remained vigilant. He felt the dragon tense underneath him, chest expanding as it drew breath for another gout of flame. "Wait for the signal," Robb said, though the wind made his voice near inaudible. He spotted the Great John's cavalry surging forward on the east, horns blaring in a cacophony that echoed across the field. From the west, the Karstark men advanced in a wedge formation, cutting off any retreat route. The Lannisters found themselves corralled between 2 advancing lines. Their response was swift. Ranks of pikemen moved to guard the flanks, Crossbowmen stepped forward, kneeling to shoot at the oncoming cavalry. The center remained, a bulwark around that command canopy, prepared to defend Tywin's position at all costs. The northern lines clashed in a roar of steel. Horses screamed as pikes found flesh. Men yelled, pushing forward in savage determination. The Lannisters fought fiercely, no sign of immediate collapse. But Robb could see the shape of the battlefield shifting as the northern forces pinned them in place. Now was the moment. If Rhaegal unleashed flame upon that center, the Lannisters would have nowhere to run. He tugged gently at the harness, guiding Rhaegal into a dive, heart pounding. Arrows flickered past, some brushing the dragon's flanks, others clattering off the armor Robb wore. He caught a glimpse of the Lannister knights below, brave men or desperate men, pointing up at the descending shape in a frenzy of fear and command. "Steady," Robb whispered, though his own stomach coiled with nerves. He pressed his knees firmly against the dragon's sides, gripping the ridge spines for balance. Rhaegal opened its jaws wide, flame shimmering in its throat. A roar surged forth, rattling the air. Then the dragon exhaled. A torrent of emerald fire blasted the center, sweeping in a wide arc that engulfed the canopy and the men guarding it. Heat waves rolled off the inferno, turning the damp morning air into a furnace. Robb saw the shapes of men inside the flames, silhouettes thrashing, falling, dissolving into ashes. Cloth and leather caught fire instantly. Steel glowed red before melting. The canopy itself collapsed in a wave of sparks, toppling as its poles were burned through. The roar of the conflagration drowned out everything else. Rhaegal pulled up, wings beating heavily, sending streams of cinders drifting behind. For an instant, Robb was blinded by the brightness of the flame. Then it receded, leaving a char-black stain on the ground where men had stood. It was a terrible, awe-inspiring sight, like the wrath of gods unleashed. He scanned the devastation, uncertain if Tywin was among the slain. He saw no sign of the lion's distinctive banner there anymore, though the swirling smoke made it difficult to see. If Tywin had been near that canopy, he was likely gone, but he could not be sure. All along the Lannister lines, chaos erupted. The men realized their central command had been obliterated in a single blast. Confusion rippled outward. Archers dropped their bows. Some footmen turned to flee. Knights tried to regroup but lacked direction. The northern lines pressed their advantage, forcing the disorganized Lannisters into a retreat that rapidly became a rout. Horses without riders galloped madly. The battle was tilting toward victory. Still astride Rhaegal, Robb circled once more, scanning for pockets of resistance. A group of Lannister knights, perhaps 100 strong, continued to fight near a makeshift cluster of wagons. Their standard was lowered, but they seemed determined not to yield. Part of Robb admired their bravery even as he recognized the futility. He saw Great Jon Umber's cavalry bear down on them with a thunder of hooves. Another wave of smoke rolled across the field. Robb realized he'd lost track of the command canopy in the haze. He guided Rhaegal back toward the blackened ruin where it had once stood, ignoring the stench that churned his stomach. The dragon's flight was laborious, each wing beat visibly strained. Robb felt an ache of sympathy. They landed heavily, almost crashing, near the scorched remains. The ground was a smoldering pit of ashes and twisted steel. Bodies lay in grotesque heaps, armor melted to flesh. Robb gagged, turning his head away from the searing odor. Rhaegal growled, pacing in a circle, tail lashing like a restless cat. Squinting through the smoke, Robb dismounted. "Wait here," he told the dragon, though Rhaegal paid him no heed, continuing to stamp and hiss at the acrid air. Robb advanced cautiously over the scorched earth, boots crunching on charred debris. He had to be certain. If Tywin lived, the war would continue. He picked his way through the devastation, eyes watering, scanning for any sign of armor that might be recognizable. It was grim work. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition, curled in unnatural poses. A pang of guilt gnawed at Robb as he stepped over a fallen soldier. This was war, one he had chosen. Yet the alternative was Lannister victory, more red weddings, more betrayals, more atrocities visited on the north. He passed the collapsed canopy poles, half melted into lumps, the fabric reduced to glowing embers. Then he saw a patch of crimson cloth, a torn scrap that might have been part of a highborn's cloak. Not far from it lay a figure encased in blackened plate, the armor fused in places from intense heat. The man's face was unrecognizable, cooked away by flame, but a heavy, charcoaled gauntlet still clutched the hilt of a sword with a golden lion pommel. Robb felt his breath catch. Could that be Tywin? He nudged the gauntlet with a trembling foot, but it was fused to the earth. The face beneath the visor was a blackened skull. He had no way of knowing for certain. A sudden stir in the ash behind him made Robb whirl, sword half drawn. In the haze, another shape stumbled forward, coughing violently. It was a man wearing half-burned Lannister mail, one side of his face blistered by flame. He raised a trembling hand. "Mercy," he choked out, voice raw dew. "Mercy. Please." He collapsed to his knees, ragged breath scraping. Robb crouched beside him, ignoring the wave of revulsion at the man's charred skin. "Where's Tywin?" he demanded, voice tight. "Did he burn here?" The soldier tried to speak, but coughed again, droplets of blood flecking his lips. His eyes were wild with pain. "He fled," the man rasped at last. "Horses took him before the flame." Then he wheezed, spitting blood, and collapsed face forward into the ash, not moving. Robb felt his insides twist. Tywin had escaped. Of course he had. The old lion would not so easily let himself be trapped in a fiery ring. It meant the war was not over, though the Lannister army here was decisively crushed. If Tywin had retreated, he might gather new forces, or slink back to Casterly Rock, or vanish among the alliances he'd so carefully fostered. A wave of rage coursed through Robb at the thought of all the lives lost just now, while Tywin slipped away to scheme another day. He forced himself to breathe, swallowing the bitter fury. This was victory, and a meaningful one. The Lannisters had been broken on this field, their scorpions destroyed, their morale shattered by dragonfire. For now, that would have to be enough. He rose to his feet, blinking against the smoke, and beckoned to Rhaegal. The dragon lumbered closer, letting out a low rumble. Together, they departed the charred center, returning to more stable ground where the northern banners had begun to converge in ragged triumph. The rest of the Lannister host was scattering, some dropping weapons to flee across the fields, some throwing themselves on the mercy of the Starks. Northern men walked among the wounded, sorting friend from foe. Archers formed a perimeter to keep any stray Lannister companies from returning to disrupt the aftermath. Calls of victory for the king in the north, and the winged wolf echoed among the battered troops. The Great John galloped up to Robb, dismounting in a single heavy stride, face split by a bloodthirsty grin. "We have them on the run, Your Grace," he exclaimed, ignoring the dust that coated his tunic and the shallow cut across his forehead. 1,000 Lannister corpses, maybe more, and thrice that number fleeing south. We'll pick off what we can, but they're done for today. Where's Tywin?" "Nay." Robb shook his head, frustration tightening his throat. "He escaped," he said curtly. "I don't know how many men he had with him, but it can't be a large force. Likely he's heading south to regroup." The Great John spat on the ground. "Curse him. But the day is ours regardless. Thanks to your dragon, the field belongs to the north." Other lords began to gather. Karstarks, Glovers, Reeds. Some were wounded, leaning on spears or supported by aides. A few offered Robb cheers, raised fists, or weary smiles of relief. The sense of camaraderie and triumph mixed with the overshadowing horror of the battlefield. Wounded men groaning, crows circling overhead, piles of the dead lying in dark puddle. Robb could not let the exultation fully penetrate the sorrow in his heart. Still, he managed to nod, acknowledging the men's rightful pride. His eyes drifted to Rhaegal, who crouched protectively near him. The dragon was panting, blood oozing sluggishly from the arrow punctures in its wing. The creature's eyes darted restlessly, scanning the field for fresh threats. Robb laid a hand on its flank. "Send riders to gather the wounded," he commanded the lords, turning halfway to face them. "Give the Lannister survivors a chance to yield. Any man who lays down arms is to be taken prisoner, not slaughtered. We've spilled enough blood. A few knights exchanged uncertain glances, but none openly opposed him. Also, Robb continued, "We'll need to find a place where Rhaegal can rest and be tended to. This wound has grown worse. We must see to it before infection sets in." One of the Karstark lords bowed his head. "We'll set up a makeshift camp near that orchard to the north. The ground is drier there. Your grace can bring the dragon, and we'll send for the best field medics we have. Some herbal poultices might soothe the creature if it'll allow it." Robb nodded his thanks, stifling a weary sigh. "Very well. See it done. I want full reports on our losses and account of the enemies, including any notable prisoners or casualties. Send out scouts to track Tywin's direction, but tell them to beware traps." The men saluted, setting off in all directions, swirling in the chaos of victory. Robb signaled to Rhaegal, who groaned but followed as he began walking across the churned, blood-soaked field. The adrenaline of battle slowly ebbed, leaving him conscious of every ache and bruise, from the countless times he'd nearly been unseated mid-flight or jarred by the dragon's abrupt movements. A wave of exhaustion pressed on him, heavier than the fur cloak he sometimes wore in Winterfell's courtyards. But there was much to be done. He forced his back straight, reminding himself that a king could not yield to weariness when his men needed him. Every few steps, soldiers on the field would halt whatever they were doing to stare at the sight of Robb guiding the dragon through the carnage. Some faces shone with admiration, others with dread, as though uncertain whether to rejoice in the presence of so terrible a power. A few men bowed, their voices trembling with what sounded like a mixture of gratitude and fear. Robb returned curt nods, mindful that word of this victory would soon spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The king in the north, astride a dragon, had routed the Lannisters on open ground, something few would have believed possible even a fortnight ago. When they reached the orchard, the scattered apple trees were stripped nearly bare from the war camps that had passed through. Broken branches lay among the roots, and half the grass was churned to mud by wagons. A clearing near the orchard center offered enough space for Rhaegal to settle without risk of damaging the fruit trees further. Robb coaxed the dragon onto a patch of relatively level ground, wincing every time the beast limped on the injured wing. Finally, Rhaegal folded its legs, letting out a long, pained hiss and resting its massive head on the ground. Robb knelt by its flank, removing his gauntlets to run a hand gently over the scales near the wound. Closer inspection revealed that the arrow had torn a small hole, but the edges were ragged, and the membrane around it was swollen. With a heavy sigh, Robb pressed a palm to the hot skin, feeling the faint tremor of the dragon's labored breaths. "Thank you," he whispered. "You were brave, brave as any man here. If not braver, let's hope we can help you recover." A soft rumble stirred in Rhaegal's throat, almost a purr, though tinged with discomfort. Robb felt a pang of affection for the creature that had risked its life again and again this day. He gave a weary half-smile and looked up to see a few of his personal guard approaching, leading a pair of shaggy northern horses loaded with supplies. One of the men, a gangly youth who'd once been a stable hand at Winterfell, carried a bundle of linen bandages. Another had a leather satchel of herbs and poultices gleaned from local foragers. "Be careful," Robb warned them. "He's in pain. Do nothing abrupt." The men approached gingerly, their eyes darting over the dragon's massive form. Rhaegal watched them with unblinking intensity, its pupils narrowed to slits. One of the men knelt, carefully setting the bandages aside. Another rummaged in the satchel for a salve, said to help with burns and inflamed wounds. Robb took it from him, unscrewing the small clay jar. The smell was pungent, made from ground pine resin and other forest herbs. He glanced at Rhaegal. "This might sting," he said, though he had no way of knowing if the dragon understood. Gently, he dabbed the salve around the torn edges. Rhaegal flinched once, releasing a puff of black smoke from its nostrils. One of the guards nearly scrambled back, but Robb held his ground, continuing with slow, gentle strokes, letting the salve seep in. Next came a wide linen bandage that they tried to affix around the wing joint, though the scale ridges made it awkward. After several attempts, they managed a kind of wrap that would keep the poultice in place. Rhaegal tolerated it, though the dragon's eyes never left Robb's face, as if trying to gauge whether this was help or harm. By the time the makeshift tending was done, a ring of watchers had gathered. Knights, squires, men-at-arms, all gazing in hushed fascination at the scene of their king, tending a dragon's wound. One of the older knights muttered something about Valyria, crossing himself as though warding off dark sorcery. Robb shot him a hard look, but said nothing. The war had changed them all in ways they did not yet understand. He stood, wiping sweat and ash from his brow. His sword and armor felt heavier than ever, and blood from a shallow cut on his temple had dried, making his hair stick to his skin. "Set up a command tent here," he told the men. "I'll receive reports on casualties, and I want to send out scouts immediately. Tywin will have a day's head start at best, but if we move quickly, we might catch him or at least confirm his route." A chorus of nods greeted him. The watchers dispersed, many glancing back at Rhaegal in mute awe. Robb sank onto a battered log, exhaling sharply. He yearned for a moment's rest to strip off the armor that chafed his shoulders and simply lie still until sleep claimed him. But the realm seldom allowed kings such luxuries, especially in the wake of battle. Instead, he forced himself to look around. The orchard was filling with wounded men, spread on blankets or bedrolls, moaning in pain. A triage area had formed under the oversight of a grizzled maester, who washed wounds with wine, stitched gashes, and tried to keep men alive. The stench of blood mingled with the bittersweet fragrance of bruised apples and pine resin. Every so often, a fresh wave of injured arrived, carried by their comrades. Cries of agony rose in the midday sun. Some minutes later, Lord Karstark approached, armor dented from the fray, his usually pale features drawn with fatigue. "Your Grace," he said, giving a slight bow. "We've tallied as best we can for now. It seems we've lost near 1,000 men, with many wounded. The Lannisters. We estimate they've left well over 3,000 dead, and perhaps half as many captured. A fraction fled south. A fierce victory, but a costly one." Robb lowered his gaze. Each of those 1,000 men lost was a father, son, brother to someone in the north. Another heavy weight to bear. "And Tywin?" he asked. "Any sign of him among the dead or captured?" Karstark shook his head. "Not yet. Our scouts claim they saw a mounted party break off just before the dragon's flame struck the center. A few recognized the lion banner. It can't have been large, maybe a dozen riders, but we suspect Tywin was among them. The old lion's cunning. He must have anticipated the threat and bolted." Robb's jaw tightened. "Then we'll keep searching. Post riders on every road south. With luck, we might cut him off if he tries to rejoin any loyal bannermen. But given his gold, he'll likely find protection. We cannot assume the war is ended." "Indeed." Karstark bowed again. "Indeed, Your Grace. But we can at least celebrate this day. Tywin's host is shattered, and word will spread of our dragon. Many lords in the south will think twice before lending him aid now." Robb nodded, acknowledging the truth. "Yes. Let them quake at the thought." He rose, ignoring the protest of his muscles, and placed a hand on Karstark's shoulder. "See to your men. Let them know how proud I am of them. We'll gather tonight to burn the dead and honor their sacrifice. After that, we must plan our next moves. Best of all." Karstark inclined his head solemnly, then turned to go. Robb trudged toward a small group of captured Lannister soldiers who had been made to kneel under guard. They looked up at him with expressions of terrified awe. Their armor was dented and splattered with gore. One man's helmet was gone, revealing close-cropped auburn hair dark with sweat. Robb's guards parted as he approached. "I offer you the chance to swear fealty," he said, voice steady. "Yield your arms to the king in the north, and you will be treated fairly. Attempt to resist or escape, and justice will be swift." Some of the men nodded, too frightened to speak. One soldier spat blood and muttered something inaudible, but when Robb's gaze pinned him, he lowered his eyes. The guard hustled them away to a makeshift pen where they would wait to be ransomed or interrogated. Robb felt no satisfaction in this. For all their cruelties, these were men, not beasts, and war had forced them here as much as anything else. He sighed and turned back, scanning for a place to rest. The orchard's edge offered a bit of shade. He made his way over, stepping gingerly around piles of discarded spears and battered shields. Some men slumped against the trunks, pressing cloth to their wounds. Others lay silent, eyes glazed, slipping away into death. Robb's throat tightened. He crouched beside a wounded northerner, a youth with curly brown hair, who couldn't have seen more than 18 summers. The boy's left leg ended below the knee, bandaged in a hastily tied tourniquet. He gazed up at Robb with feverish eyes. "Your Grace," he whispered, tears mingling with sweat. Did we win?" Robb swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes," he said softly. "We won. You fought bravely." He took the boy's hand, feeling it quake. "Hold on, our maester will see to you. We'll get you a proper stump, a crutch, you'll live." The boy's face contorted in relief, or perhaps pain, and he nodded weakly. As Robb rose, the weight of responsibility pressed on him with renewed force. It was not enough to win battles. He had to care for his people, see them through the harsh times ahead. The war was far from over. Tywin might still rally allies among the Crown lands or the Reach, or the remnants of the Freys. And what of Daenerys Targaryen? She was out there, possibly hearing reports of her dragon in northern hands. Would she see Robb as a thief or an ally? Too many questions swirled in his mind, each one pulling at him like wolves tearing at a carcass. He finally returned to Rhaegal's side, sinking down near the dragon's shoulder. The beast studied him with an unwavering stare. Robb offered a piece of salted meat one of his men had brought, though it was hardly the fresh kill the dragon preferred. Rhaegal sniffed, flicked its forked tongue, then accepted it with a quick snap. An uneasy truce with the presence of all these watchers. The beast's chest rumbled deeply, a sound Robb had come to think of as grudging contentment. Night began to fall on the orchard. Torches lit around the perimeter, casting flickering light upon the piled bodies of the dead. The Northmen labored to bury or burn their fallen brethren, while separate pyres were built for the Lannisters. Grief mingled with quiet celebration at having survived. Somewhere, a few men half-heartedly sang a war ballad, though the notes fell flat in the gloom. The dancing shadows threw Rhaegal's silhouette into a twisted shape that loomed across the ground like a mythical terror. Robb accepted a waterskin from one of his guards, gulping the cool liquid. His throat burned from smoke inhalation. He rubbed a hand across his gritty face, letting exhaustion seep in for a moment. A messenger approached, cloak spattered in mud, bearing fresh tidings. Some Lannister survivors had fled toward the hills, while others had cast their weapons aside and begged for mercy. No sign of Tywin. There was rumor that he might head for the Golden Tooth, or even attempt to cross into the Vale. Robb suspected he'd try to regroup at some fortress loyal to House Lannister. Or perhaps retreat all the way to Casterly Rock. "We'll let him run," Robb said after a beat. "For now. We need to regroup, tend our wounded, and consolidate this territory. Without Tywin's main army, the Riverlands will be safer for our allies. But keep scouts watching. If Tywin tries to muster another army, I want to know before it forms." "Aye." The messenger nodded and departed. Robb realized how hollow his own words sounded. Yes, Tywin's host was shattered. But the war spirit was not so easily snuffed out. A single man like Tywin Lannister could hide, gather gold, hire sellswords. He might strike again at a time of his choosing. Robb glanced at Rhaegal, as if the dragon's presence alone could reassure him. Even if Daenerys Targaryen came north demanding her dragon's return, Robb might need to forge an alliance. The future felt as clouded as the battlefield had been with smoke. Torches burned low. Men dozed where they could. Robb rose stiffly, crossing to a large campfire near the orchard's edge. There, his principal bannermen had gathered. The Great Jun, Karstark, a maester, and a few other lords. They paused in their hushed conversation as he approached. The Great Jun stood and gestured for Robb to take the best seat, a simple log draped with a cloak. Robb eased down, wincing at the ache in his back. "My lords," he began, eyeing them in the dancing firelight. Their faces looked drawn but triumphant. "Today was a harsh battle, but we've dealt a crushing blow to the Lannisters. Let no man doubt our strength. Even so, we cannot rest on our laurels. Tywin still draws breath, and winter creeps upon us. Our plan remains to secure the riverlands and protect the roads north. We'll keep a garrison here, then push south as needed once our wounded can travel." They murmured agreement, though some asked if they should pursue Tywin immediately. Robb shook his head. Chasing him blindly is a fool's errand. He'll set ambushes, lure us into traps. Better to force him to come to us, deny him allies, starve him of supplies. In time, he'll be forced to make a final stand, or attempt some desperate scheme. The conversation turned practical. How many men to leave behind, how to provision the host, who would handle the prisoners and the burial of the dead. The Great John offered to lead the pursuit of fleeing Lannisters come morning, capturing stragglers. Karstark promised men to guard the roads. Robb listened, offered input, and found his gaze drifting to the gloom where Rhaegal's silhouette loomed beyond the ring of torchlight. The dragon was awake, eyes shining like coals in the darkness. A silent testament to a power from another age now bound, however tentatively, to the cause of the North. When the war council ended, the men drifted away, each bearing new orders. Robb lingered by the fire, letting the warmth loosen the knots in his shoulders. A faint breeze stirred the scent of charred wood and rotting bodies, a reminder that the day's carnage was far from cleared. He closed his eyes, remembering the exhilarating rush of flight, the monstrous roar of flame, the weight of destruction left in its wake. If he had not found Rhaegal in the forests of the north, the Lannisters might have marched all the way to Winterfell, ravaging what was left of his homeland. This savage power in his hands had saved countless northern lives. Yet it filled him with an unease he could not fully name. Somewhere behind him, the Great John's hearty laughter burst forth, mingled with the softer voices of men telling stories of the day's heroics. They were proud, as men often were after a victorious battle. Robb could not begrudge them that. He pulled his cloak tighter, feeling a chill that was not from the weather alone. Eventually, he stood, weary bones protesting, and walked over to where Rhaegal lay. The beast's wound was covered by the bandage, though little flecks of green scales and dried blood clung to the edges. The dragon's head rose at his approach, golden eyes reflecting the firelight. Robb lowered himself to sit near the creature's massive foreleg, his breath clouding in the cool night air. "Sleep if you can," he murmured, his voice soft as a lullaby. "We'll both need our strength for what's to come." Rhaegal blinked, a slow deliberate movement, then exhaled a gust of warm breath that rustled Robb's hair. Perhaps it was agreement, or simply acknowledgement. Robb found himself leaning back against the dragon's shoulder, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall, a living furnace that pushed away the night's chill. For a moment, the stench of the battlefield receded, replaced by the closeness of this impossible creature. He found his thoughts drifting to what his father would have said if he could see Robb now. Ned Stark, ever the honorable lord, must have never dreamed of a Stark riding a dragon. Yet Robb felt certain that if it served to protect the North, his father would see it as just. The old gods moved in strange ways. Direwolves, dragons, the ancient magics awakened by the world's strife. He remembered his father's voice. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Now the pack encompassed not only his bannermen and allies, but a dragon that bent its proud neck to him. It was a daunting responsibility. Night deepened, studded by pale stars. From the distance, a few scattered war cries rose as northern scouts chased the last Lannister stragglers into the darkness. Then quiet settled over the orchard, broken only by the crackle of flames and the low moans of the wounded. Robb forced himself to remain awake, to remain vigilant, but exhaustion seeped into his limbs like poison. At length he let his eyes slip closed. His head nodded, and he surrendered to the tide of sleep against the dragon's flank. Lulled by the deep, steady hum of Rhaegal's breath, he dreamed of ice and fire, of direwolves bounding through dark forests where a green dragon perched in the boughs like a strange bird of prey. He dreamed of Tywin Lannister, his pale eyes glinting in a shadowed keep, pulling the strings of some hidden contrivance. He dreamed of the howling winds of winter that battered the walls of Winterfell, swirling snow so thick it buried entire armies. And yet, in the midst of the gale, Rhaegal roared, his flames carving a path of light through the darkness. Robb reached out in that dream, a swirl of white wolf fur at his side, and together they advanced against an unseen enemy. At some point before dawn, he jolted awake, heart hammering. Rhaegal stirred beneath him, blinking in the faint glow of the dying fire. For a moment, Robb forgot where he was. Then the events of the battle returned in a rush, and he inhaled unsteadily. Stars still pricked the sky, but the eastern horizon bore the promise of morning. He rubbed stiff muscles and rose, the weight of armor replaced by a dull ache. In the distance, the great Joan's voice once again thundered, rallying men for a final sweep of the battlefield. Robb scanned the orchard, seeing the tired faces of his guards. Some perked up at his movement, ready to escort him if needed. The crows had gathered in great numbers at the fringes, picking at corpses. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down. This was the cost of war. This was what it meant to be king in the north, forging a future out of blood and ash. He gave Rhaegal one last grateful pat, feeling the hot exhalation against his hand. The dragon seemed more rested, though the bandaged wing would need proper tending once they returned somewhere with better facilities. Robb could only hope that in time the wound would fully heal and not hinder flight. Without Rhaegal, how would he stand against the cunning of Tywin or the uncertain powers moving through Westeros? Targaryen or not, the realm would soon discover that House Stark had gained an ally of fire. Pushing away the lingering chill of his dream, Robb turned to face the orchard that had become a temporary fortress. The shouts of men around him reminded him of his duties. Another day of command, of decisions, and soon they would march again, carrying both hope and dread in their wake. The wind ruffled his hair, bringing with it the faintest smell of distant pine and the crisp tang of approaching winter. He steeled himself, heart resolute. The war was not finished, but with the dragon at his side and the north behind him, Robb Stark stood ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant chasing Tywin Lannister to the ends of the earth. For the pack survives, and the dragon roars. And so the young wolf's legend marched onward, unbowed by the horrors of the day, guided by the dream of a free and secure north. A place where winter might come and go, but the fire of a green-scaled ally would keep the darkness at bay. Dawn came slowly, a pale wash of light across the orchard where so many had huddled in exhaustion and pain. Robb stood beside Rhaegal, who dozed fitfully in the muddy clearing. In the half-light, the dragon's bandaged wing and the scarred patch of scales glowed with a dull jade hue, and Robb pressed his hand to the beast's neck in a mute gesture of reassurance. Rhaegal twitched, then gave a soft hiss that trailed off into silence. The orchard smelled of damp earth, bruised apples, and the cloying stench of blood. Around them, the bustle of waking men and shifting armor signaled another day of war. No one yet cheered or celebrated, as if the war were won. The Northmen were well aware that Tywin still breathed. The great blow dealt to the Lannisters in open battle had shaken their power, but not destroyed it outright. And so the orchard camp stirred with a grim determination. Small groups of soldiers gathered for meager breakfasts of hard bread and watered ale. Some knelt by the makeshift graves dug for fallen comrades, heads bent in quiet reflection. Others sat under bare-limbed trees, carefully sharpening weapons or replacing missing straps on dented cuirasses. The crows roosted on higher branches, lazily eyeing the living in anticipation of more spoil. Robb took a moment to drag a hand across his unshaven jaw, feeling the stubble scratch his palm. Tired as he was, he could not let the day begin without seeing to the needs of his men and the state of his command. Pain throbbed in his temples, and he realized he had not eaten since well before the battle. One of his guards approached, handing him a small chunk of salt beef and a piece of half-stale bread. Robb mumbled thanks, biting into it without much appetite. At least the strong salt taste forced him to swallow, rousing him a little from the lingering weight of sleep. Some 20 paces away, Lord Karstark conferred with a pair of grim-faced scouts. Their voices were low, but Robb caught enough fragments. Mentions of small bands of Lannisters, possible sightings of Tywin riding hard for the Golden Tooth, rumors that a Frey contingent might have joined him. Fury kindled within Robb. He tamped it down, reminding himself that a show of anger would do little good. Instead, he finished his meager meal, brushed crumbs from his hands, and crossed the mud to hear the reports in full. Karstark inclined his head in respect. The two scouts bowed as Robb approached. One had scratches across his cheek and a bandage wound around his left arm. The other a young woman in boiled leather who carried a bow nearly as tall as she was. Both looked exhausted, eyes underscored with shadows. "My lord," the young woman said, voice raspy from a long night of riding. "We found evidence that Tywin and a small escort have gone west, staying off the main roads. Their tracks were seen near an abandoned hamlet. Just footprints and hoof marks. They're moving quickly. Some locals say they spied a lion banner, but it's possible they're hiding it. We think they aim for the Gold Road, or perhaps the pass near the Golden Tooth." Robb's gaze flicked toward the western horizon. The Golden Tooth guarded the main approach into the Lannister heartlands. If Tywin reached it, he could fortify behind those stout walls, or hurry on to Casterly Rock. "What about the rest of his men?" he asked. "Are there any larger forces gathering, or is it all scattered remnants?" The male scout, older and with weathered features, shook his head. "Mostly broken remnants, Your Grace. We've captured or killed many stragglers. Some have fled south, or tried to hide in the hills. As far as we can tell, Tywin left the bulk of his army behind once the dragon appeared. If he manages to reach the Golden Tooth, he might muster a new force. But as of now, his numbers are slim." Robb nodded slowly, forcing down a surge of frustration. A small victory at least, that Tywin could not immediately field another vast army. Still, the idea of the old lion slipping away gnawed at him. They had come so close to ending Tywin's threat once and for all. Letting him escape opened the door to future betrayal, future bloodshed. Yet chasing him headlong through unknown terrain was risky. Robb's father had taught him to never hunt a cornered animal without caution. It could turn on you with surprising ferocity. He turned to Karstark. "And the orchard? How many of our wounded are fit to travel?" Karstark drew a heavy breath. "It's hard to say, Your Grace. The maesters are still busy. Some men will never walk again. Others might regain enough strength after a few days of rest. But for now, we have many wounded who can't be moved far. At least not without risking more harm." Robb glanced over at Rhaegal. The dragon lifted its head, sniffing the dawn air, then shifted to a new position with a low groan. The bandage was stained but intact, and the wound no longer bled openly. Yet Rhaegal's wings remained partially folded, as if flight would be too great a burden. Robb could almost feel the beast's pain. Perhaps in time the wound would fully heal. But not if they demanded too much of Rhaegal too soon. He turned back to Karstark. "We'll keep our main camp here for a short while," he decided. "Let the wounded mend as best they can. Meanwhile, I'll send out parties to secure the local villages, gather supplies, and watch for any Lannister regrouping. If Tywin's truly heading west, we'll consider a strike in that direction, once we're strong enough. I won't lead a battered army in pursuit if we can't sustain ourselves." "Nefsens." Karstark bowed in agreement, the tension in his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'll see to it, and if we capture anyone else who might know Tywin's plans, we'll bring them straight to you." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Greatjon, loud as always. Though his steps were weary, he stomped over in heavy boots, spattered in dried mud, his broad face bearing fresh cuts. Despite his exhaustion, a grin cracked his thick beard. "Your Grace," he boomed, clasping Robb's arm in a warrior's greeting. "You're up at last. We have a trophy you might want to see." Robb's eyebrow arched in curiosity. "A trophy?" The Greatjon nodded, gesturing behind him. Two of his men dragged a prisoner forward. A tall, lean Lannister soldier with a gaunt face, burn scars creeping along his jaw. The man's hands were bound, and he stumbled as they forced him to his knees before Robb. "This one tried to slip away last night," the Greatjon said. "But we caught him skulking near the tents. He's no lord, but he's got a sharp mind for strategy. Seems he was one of Tywin's couriers." "Nana Wans." "And Mulimun da." Robb studied the prisoner. The man's eyes darted nervously between Robb and Karstark, lingering on the looming shape of Rhaegal, who let out a low hiss. "Your name?" Robb asked. The prisoner swallowed hard. "Sir Daniel Prester, my lord. Though I suppose that title means little now." He glared at the ground, face pale with dread. "Sir Daniel," Robb repeated. "If you've served as a courier, you might have some knowledge of Tywin's plans. Will you speak freely, or must I persuade you?" Nah. A flicker of fear lit the knight's eyes. "I've seen what your dragon can do," he said hoarsely. "I have no wish to be burned alive. But Tywin Lannister is not a forgiving man either." He hesitated, as if balancing which fate he feared more. The Great John snorted. "We can always see if the dragon's hungry for breakfast." Robb held up a hand to silence him. "I'm no monster, Sir Daniel. Give me honest answers, and I'll consider leniency. Lie to me or refuse, and you'll see what a dragon's flame feels like." He allowed a measured pause to let the threat sink in. Then he crouched, meeting the knight's gaze. "Now, what do you know of Tywin's next move?" Sir Daniel licked his cracked lips. "He's heading west, yes. But not only for the Golden Tooth. Word spread through his camp that he means to gather men from House Lefford, House Brax, maybe House Craighall. They're smaller houses loyal to the Lion. He believes that if he can raise a few thousand men and fortify the pass, it'll be enough to deter a direct assault until he can strike alliances further south, maybe even with the Tyrells, if they can be swayed back to Lannister coin." "Dendire." Robb narrowed his eyes. The Tyrells had, in theory, allied with the Iron Throne, but their loyalties had shifted often. He couldn't dismiss the possibility of them rejoining the Lannisters if offered enough advantage. "What of King's Landing?" he asked. "Is Tywin leaving the capital to its own devices?" Sir Daniel's lips twitched. "He believes the crown can fend for itself, or that Cersei will manage affairs there. His priority is maintaining House Lannister's power base in the west. If it means losing the capital, so be it. The Rock matters most to him." Cold realization settled in Robb's gut. Tywin's strategy was pragmatic. Cede a ground if necessary, protect the seat of Lannister power. Given time, the old Lion could rebuild an army from the gold mines and loyal vassals. Robb stood, arms folding over his chest. And what of his knowledge of the dragon? Does he have any plan to kill or capture it, or is he resigned to avoiding confrontation? Sir Daniel's gaze flicked to Rhaegal again. He saw what happened on the battlefield. He lost his scorpions, and his men are terrified of those flames. Still, he's not a man to accept defeat easily. There are whisperings that Qyburn, one of his foul maesters, might craft new weapons, bigger scorpions, or contraptions loaded with wildfire. Tywin told his lords that if he can just survive the next few moons, he'll have ways to counter a Robb felt a sour twist in his stomach. Wildfire. The mere word conjured images of green explosions, unstoppable flames. He nodded tersely. "You've been honest enough. I'll have you placed in the prisoner camp under guard. If you behave, you'll be fed and kept alive until the war's end. Step out of line and the consequences will be immediate." He gestured for the guards to haul him away. Sir Daniel let out a ragged sigh, relief mingling with dread, and allowed himself to be led off. The Great John scratched his beard, eyeing Robb. "So the Lion scurries west, intent on forging alliances. I say we chase him at once. Let's put an end to this war." Robb studied his friend's eager face, recalling how the Great John had always thirsted for bold action. In other times, Robb might have welcomed that aggression. But the dragons wound, the battered state of his own men, and the looming threat of winter all conspired against a hasty pursuit. "If we push west too soon," Robb said, "we risk overextending ourselves. Our men are weary and wounded, and Rhaegal cannot fight at full strength. The Lannisters could lure us into a fortress siege, forcing a long stalemate. No, better we recover here and strengthen the Riverlands first. A weakened chase might end in our undoing." "No." The Great Joan's mouth tightened, but he bowed his head. "As you will, Your Grace, but don't let the Lion slip away too far. It's in my blood to chase a wounded beast." Karstark cleared his throat. We'll post outriders to the west to keep an eye on Tywin's movements. If we see an opportunity to strike a smaller force, we will. But a direct assault on the Golden Tooth might be too high a cost. Robb murmured assent. As much as he longed to corner Tywin, he would not throw away the advantage they had bled so dearly to gain. There was also the matter of Rhaegal. He turned once more to where the dragon half-dozed in the muddy grass. They needed a place with better shelter, enough space for a creature of that size, and a supply of meat that could keep it fed until it recovered. The orchard was hardly a permanent base, with winter creeping closer. He made his decision on the spot. "We'll move north again," he said. "Only a short distance. There's a castle near the twins that might serve. Though I'd rather not approach the Freys. Or perhaps a lesser keep along the river, one that belongs to a loyal bannerman. We need walls, storehouses, and a stable courtyard for Rhaegal. Let me think." He paused, recalling the local geography. Raventree Hall, seat of House Blackwood, is not far from here. Lord Tito's Blackwood has always been staunchly loyal to our cause. His courtyard is large, and he hates the Freys almost as much as we do. We'll approach him. If he grants us shelter, we'll rest, reorganize, and plan our next move. Neptune. Karstark nodded. A wise choice. Raventree Hall is well fortified. The approach from the west is obstructed by thick forest. Tywin can't surprise us easily. The Great John let out a satisfied grunt. Then let's waste no time. I'll pass the word for the men to gather what gear we can salvage. We'll leave a token force to bury the dead properly, or burn them if need be. Robb muttered in acknowledgement. Even that task felt monumental. Countless corpses still lay out in the fields beyond the orchard, Lannister and Northern alike. He thought of how his mother would have insisted on honoring the fallen, seeing them sent to whatever gods they worship. He prayed that somewhere, her restless spirit might find solace in the knowledge that her son fought to protect the North and avenge the betrayal that ended her life. He exhaled, turning to feed Rhaegal some scraps of salted pork brought by one of the cooks. The dragon sniffed at the meat, eyes half-lidded, then tore into it with a savage snap of jaws. There was a faint tremor each time it moved its left wing, telling Robb that the creature was in constant pain. He resolved to take extra care in traveling. Rhaegal would likely have to walk much of the distance, or attempt short flights only if absolutely necessary. The camp broke slowly, men trudging to assemble gear, the wounded groaning as they were hoisted onto wagons. A handful of battered tents were struck, revealing churned mud underneath. In the distance, crows rose in scattered flocks, spooked by the men who ventured out to retrieve the last of the northern bodies. Robb helped where he could, offering quiet words of encouragement, though his authority soon became a double-edged sword. So many men clamored for his attention. An older soldier, cradling a shattered arm, begged him for guidance on what to do about his home in the Riverlands. Another demanded to know how they'd handle Lannister prisoners once they reached Raventree. Everywhere he turned, there were questions, pleas, reminders of the war's ongoing toll. By midday, the host began moving in a ragged procession northward. Robb led the way on horseback, reins in one hand, the other resting lightly on his sword hilt. Rhaegal followed at a lumbering pace, flanked by a company of archers who kept a cautious distance. The dragon's steps sent vibrations through the ground, and now and then it unleashed a low growl as if complaining about the forced march. Yet it stayed with them, responding whenever Robb circled back on his horse to speak softly or offer another piece of meat. Observers from afar might have called the sight surreal. A war host trudging through trampled fields, a living dragon pacing among them like an enormous hound, and the battered banners of House Stark fluttering overhead. As the day wore on, the fields gave way to low rolling hills patched with brown grass and skeletal trees. The sky remained overcast, threatening rain that never fully arrived. Occasionally they passed small farmsteads, windows shuttered tight, the occupants peering out in silent fear. Robb's outriders did their best to reassure the locals, sometimes leaving behind a handful of silver or goods in exchange for fresh hay and any livestock that could feed the dragon. Though Rhaegal devoured far more than a single goat, it helped to keep him content. The people seemed less alarmed, once they saw the Northmen paying fairly instead of looting. Still, a dragon was no common sight. Children hid behind fences, eyes wide as plates, while their parents trembled or gawked. They camped that night near a shallow stream, ringed by thorny underbrush. Rhaegal settled on a patch of ground cleared by the men, letting out a pained hiss when the bandaged wing brushed a jagged rock. Robb had the men remove the rock, then sank wearily onto a fallen log. He found his appetite meager. The day's tension had left him hollow. Nonetheless, he forced himself to eat a stew of barley and dried vegetables. The Graychen hovered nearby, muttering about the day's slow progress, but admitted it was necessary to avoid aggravating Rhaegal's injury. Once the meal was done, Robb sent for the maester traveling with them, a gaunt man named Maester Conran, who had replaced the late Maester Luwin in serving the Northmen's armies. Conran approached Rhaegal with trepidation, carrying a large clay pot of ointment. Robb stood by to keep the dragon calm, stroking the scales near its neck, as the maester carefully peeled away the linen bandage. Rhaegal let out a sharp hiss at the tug, black smoke curling from its nostrils. A few men stepped back, eyes wide, but Robb held his ground, speaking in a low murmur. There, he said, pressing one hand gently on Rhaegal's shoulder. We have to clean the wound. The sooner it heals, the sooner you'll fly without pain. He knew not if the dragon understood his words, but the tone seemed to soothe it. The maester leaned close, examining the ragged tear. Better than yesterday, he concluded, voice wavering with nerves. No sign of infection, though the membrane is still raw. I'll apply more salve. Next. Conran's hands trembled, but he managed to smear a fresh layer of ointment around the edges of the wound, sealing it with a mixture of pine resin and ground healing herbs. Rhaegal flinched, but did not lash out. Robb silently marveled that a creature so mighty could tolerate these fumblings with only minor protest. When the bandage was replaced, Rhaegal exhaled a cloud of warm, pungent breath that made Conran cough. Then the dragon snorted, turned its head away, and settled down in the grass with a grunt, as if to say, enough. Relieved, Robb clapped the maester on the shoulder. Well done, he said, offering a small smile. You may have a second career tending to dragons. Conran paled at the thought. I pray not, your grace, he said softly, turning to shuffle off and tend to other wounded men. Robb watched him go with a note of sympathy. Everyone in this host bore burdens they had never dreamed of, from fighting Lannisters to caring for a living dragon. By the next morning, they resumed their march. The weather took a turn, a light drizzle, misting the hills and dampening cloaks. Rhaegal's scales glimmered with water droplets, turning his hide a deeper emerald that shimmered whenever sunlight broke through a crack in the clouds. The mood among the soldiers was subdued. They were far from home, uncertain if or when they might face another battle. Whispers circulated about Tywin's flight. Some insisted he was cornered. Others muttered that Tywin was unstoppable, that the old lion would appear again at the worst moment. Robb said nothing, though he remained watchful. Scouts still fanned out to the west. One or two returned with small scraps of intelligence. No sign of Tywin's main group, though a few Lannister outriders had been spotted, swiftly disappearing into the wilderness. Near dusk, they approached the outer boundaries of House Blackwood's domain. Ancient oaks rose along the roadside, their twisted limbs forming a canopy overhead. Raventree Hall stood beyond, a dark fortress of stone flanked by the dead weirwood that gave the castle its name. Robb remembered it from earlier visits, an imposing place, suffused with old mysteries. The Blackwoods claimed a lineage older than the Andal's arrival, preserving the worship of the old gods amid southern lands. Their centuries-long feud with the Brackens was legendary. None of that would matter if they refused entry. But Robb doubted they would turn away the king in the north, especially not after hearing of his victory over the Lannisters. Before they reached the gates, a party of Blackwood riders emerged from a stand of dark trees. At their head was Lord Titos Blackwood himself, a lean man with silver-threaded hair, dressed in black and red leathers, bearing the Raven sigil. He halted a stone's throw from Robb, surveying the battered northern host and the monstrous shape of Rhaegal trailing behind. Some of the riders' horses shied at the scent of the dragon, and it took all their skill to keep them under control. Robb advanced alone, raising a hand in greeting. "Lord Titos," he called, voice echoing in the still evening air. I come to you humbly, seeking shelter for my men. We've fought a battle against the Lannisters and must rest before winter sets in. Will you grant us leave to enter your hall?" "No, shall." Titos dismounted, his eyes darting from Robb to Rhaegal, lingering on the bandaged wing. He swallowed, then bowed. "Your Grace, you honor us with your presence. We heard rumors of a dragon among your ranks, but to see it—" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "The Blackwoods have always been loyal to House Stark. You're welcome here so long as you promise no harm will come to my people." Robb gave a slight smile. "We've no quarrel with you, my lord. We only seek refuge and time to recover. Our coin will pay for whatever provisions we take." He glanced back at Rhaegal. "As for the dragon, he fights alongside the North. Treat him kindly, and you'll have nothing to fear." Lord Titos nodded, though his wary expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Very well, Your Grace. Raventree Hall is yours to shelter in. We have limited resources, for the war has been hard on us all, but we'll share what we can." Robb's relief was genuine. "My thanks. We'll leave the larger part of our host encamped outside your walls, if space is an issue. But I'd like to bring Rhaegal inside if there's a courtyard large enough. He's wounded, and needs a place to rest out of the weather." Lord Titos glanced at his men. They exchanged uncertain looks. "We do have an outer courtyard that might accommodate such a beast," Titos said carefully. "You'll forgive me, but I'll keep additional guards posted to make sure panic doesn't break out." Robb inclined his head. "Of course. You must look after your own." Within the hour, they passed through the gatehouse of Raventree Hall. Columns of Stark soldiers trudging behind. The castle's walls were high and made of dark stone, the parapets lined with watchful archers. Inside, the courtyard was spacious, but cluttered with supply wagons, tethered horses, and a few wooden sheds. To one side stood the skeletal weirwood tree, its trunk massive but lifeless, branches bleached white against the gloom. Rhaegal paused upon entering, lifting his head to sniff the air. The presence of such an ancient tree, even if it was dead, seemed to stir some primal curiosity in the dragon. Men hurried to clear a wide space, pushing carts and crates aside to create a circle in which Rhaegal could lie. The Greatjon, Karstark, and other Northmen fanned out, guiding their forces to set up temporary quarters. Tents sprang up along the edges of the courtyard where possible, while the majority of men pitched camp outside the walls along the meadow. For a time, confusion reigned. Blackwood guards pointed out which parts of the fortress were off limits, while the northern soldiers did their best to find adequate shelter for the wounded. Over it all, the hush of twilight settled, turning the sky a smoky blue. Lord Titos guided Robb personally into the Great Hall, a chamber lit by torches and a large hearth fire. The hall smelled of old wood, iron, and something vaguely musty, as though the place had not seen grand feasts in many years. A tapestry depicting ravens perched on a weirwood hung behind the dais, its colors faded but still striking. Robb felt the eyes of the household upon him. Stewards, servants, a scattering of knights. Most wore the Black Raven's sigil, though a few southern mercenaries lurked near the corners, blades at their hips. "You must be weary, Your Grace," Titos said, gesturing to a long table. "I'd have food prepared, though we cannot offer a lavish feast. The times are too harsh." Robb nodded politely. "Any hot meal would be welcome. My lords and I will dine gratefully on what you can spare. After that, I'd speak with you in private about how I'll handle the coming weeks." Lord Titos gave a shallow bow. "Oh, of course. I'll see to it at once." With that, he excused himself to direct servants. Robb sank onto a bench near the hearth, feeling the warmth seep into his chilled bones. The Greatjon entered, brushing rain from his cloak, and took a seat across from Robb, exhaling loudly. "Feels good to be behind walls again, eh, lad?" the Greatjon rumbled, voice echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. "We can rest a while, mend our wounds. Then I say we ride west and finish Tywin." Robb allowed a hint of a smile. "Patience, my friend. First, we see how quickly Rhaegal heals. I won't risk a battle without our greatest advantage, and we must let our men regain their strength. A half-strength army chasing Tywin into mountainous terrain would be a fool's errand. Diwandar. The Great John grunted. Though he did not argue further, he seemed relieved enough to be out of the rain. Karstark arrived next, shaking droplets from his cloak, followed by a handful of other northern lords. They gathered around the table. When servants appeared bearing steaming trenchers of bread, bowls of broth thickened with root vegetables, and pitchers of watered wine, none complained of the meager fare. The warmth of the food and the relative safety behind stone walls lifted their spirits, if only a fraction. Between spoonfuls, they spoke of practical matters. The number of wounded men who needed bed rest, the condition of the roads, the rationing of supplies. Robb listened, occasionally offering directions or reminding them to maintain strong watch on all castle gates. If Tywin had spies lurking in the Riverlands, they might attempt sabotage. The Great John and Karstark both volunteered to rotate their loyal men for watch duty alongside the Blackwoods. Once the meal was finished, Lord Titos returned, inviting Robb for a private discussion in a smaller solar off the Great Hall. It was a cramped chamber lined with dusty shelves of old books, and a single narrow window let in the last vestiges of daylight. A battered raven perched in a corner cage, letting out a low croak as the two men entered. Tito settled into a high-backed chair and gestured for Robb to take another across from him. "How fares Lord Edmure Tully these days?" Titos asked, fiddling with a wooden raven carving on the table. "I've had no raven from him in weeks." Word was that his hold on River Run remained tenuous. Robb sighed. "Edmure was driven out of River Run briefly, but we reclaimed it after a series of skirmishes. Last I heard, he had returned to the castle, though a portion of his men had marched with me. The Lannisters have been hammered, thanks to that last battle, but Tywin still lurks at large. I suspect Edmure is doing all he can to keep the Tully seat secure." Titos nodded, relief flickering on his face. "The Blackwoods owe much to House Tully. I'd be glad to send a few men to help garrison River Run if need be, provided you consider it wise, Your Grace." "Nanitiani, I'd welcome it," Robb said. "Once we've settled here, we'll likely send a detachment to help fortify critical points in the Riverlands. The war's not done, and Tywin might strike anywhere he sees a chance." A silence followed, the shadows in the solar lengthening. Titos cleared his throat. "I confess, I never thought to see a Stark riding a dragon. Rumor has it the beast once belonged to Daenerys Targaryen. Is that true?" Robb's chest tightened. The question had lingered in his own mind. "It did," he admitted, his voice quiet. "She lost the dragon in battle against Euron Greyjoy's fleet. It was wounded and flew north, where I found it. Or it found me. We formed a bond of sorts. Now it fights for the north." "Does Daenerys know?" Titos asked, eyes glinting with curiosity. "Will she come demanding the creature's return?" "I don't know," Robb said honestly. "I've heard no word from her, but I doubt she'll simply forget one of her dragons. If she learns Rhaegal is in my hands, she might see me as an ale. Or a usurper. Targaryens have their pride, especially regarding dragons." Titos exhaled slowly. "Then you must prepare. The Targaryen queen isn't rumored to be timid. She might send her armies to reclaim what she sees as hers." Robb felt the old tension reawaken. "One war at a time, I suppose. First, we deal with Tywin. But if Daenerys appears, we'll have to weigh our options. I'd sooner negotiate than fight another front. The North has spilled enough blood." They spoke a while longer, discussing the logistics of feeding Rhaegal, which livestock herds in the region might be spared, and whether the dragon could be kept in a corner of the courtyard without alarming the locals. Lord Titos eventually rose, bowing to excuse himself. "You and your men may rest here as long as you need. My steward will assist you. If you wish to worship in our God's Wood, you're welcome. Though it's a strange place now, since the Weirwood died, we fear the old gods have fallen silent." Robb stood as well, shaking Titos' hand in gratitude. "Thank you, my lord. You do House Stark a great service. We'll do what we can to show our appreciation." They parted ways. Robb lingered in the solar a moment longer, letting the hush wrap around him. The battered raven in the corner cage stared back at him, black eyes glimmering with faint intelligence. He thought of the ravens at Winterfell, how they croaked news from across the realm. Often, that news had been dire or tragic. It made him wonder how many more tragedies lay ahead before this war found an end. Eventually, he returned to the courtyard, where night's full darkness had settled. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows on the cobblestones. Rhaegal lay curled near the old weirwood, the dragon's green scales reflecting the orange glow of firelight. Northern guards ringed him, some leaning on spears, others dozing upright from sheer fatigue. When Robb approached, Rhaegal lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Robb smiled faintly, placing a hand on the scaly neck. "You're safe here," he murmured. "Rest. Soon we'll heal your wing and we'll see about finishing this war." The dragon blinked, then let out a low rumble, as if granting agreement. Robb took a seat against a broad stone pillar not far away, letting his legs sprawl. His muscles ached, and his mind teemed with half-formed strategies. He thought of Tywin heading west, possibly forging alliances that could threaten them anew. He thought of Daenerys, an unknown force that might appear at any moment. But here, within these walls, for this single night, at least they had a measure of calm. He allowed himself to close his eyes, lulled by the distant crackle of torches and the steady breathing of the dragon. Morning arrived amid a flurry of fresh challenges. Reports came in that pockets of Lannister soldiers still roamed the countryside, harassing local farms. Lord Tydos's men had clashed with a small band the night before, driving them off but losing 2 lives in the process. Robb dispatched riders to scour the area, instructing them to capture any Lannisters who would yield, and to put down those who would not. At the same time, rationing concerns grew. The countryside had been plundered by various armies, and winter threatened. Food was scarce, and a dragon's appetite could strain the castle's supply. To mitigate that, Robb sent hunting parties into nearby forests, though the yield was uncertain. Wolves, boars, and deer were not so plentiful this deep into autumn, and feeding Rhaegal might require more livestock from nearby villages. Days passed in a restless blur. Rhaegal's wound slowly improved under Maester Conran's careful treatments. Robb made certain to visit the dragon multiple times each day, bringing fresh meat when possible, speaking in soothing tones that he hoped bridged the gap between man and beast. Each evening, he convened with his lords and Lord Tytos to discuss the state of their forces. Scouts trickled back with varied tidings. Tywin was rumored to be fortifying a small castle west of the Golden Tooth, organizing scattered forces into a new host. Or perhaps he was traveling incognito toward Casterly Rock. It was difficult to know which tales were accurate and which were planted to mislead them. One chilly morning, Robb decided to test Rhaegal's flight again, if only briefly. He waited until the courtyard was mostly clear, save for a few trusted guards. The sky was pale, promising rain, and a biting wind tugged at the banners. Rhaegal stretched his wings, releasing a low groan of discomfort. Robb gently removed the bandage. The tear in the membrane had reduced to a smaller, scabbed area. With luck, it might fully heal in weeks, but the dragon might still bear a scar. He approached Rhaegal's flank, patting it. "Let's see if you can manage a short flight, just a circle over the castle. Nothing more?" A chorus of anxious looks met him from the guards, but no one dared protest aloud. Rhaegal shifted, blinking warily, as though uncertain. Robb climbed onto the dragon's back, mindful of the new ridges where the bandage had rubbed. He secured himself with the makeshift harness. "Easy," he murmured. "Up, but not too high." Rhaegal crouched, muscles flexing under emerald scales. Then, with a whoosh, the dragon beat its wings, stirring a gale of dust and leaves that whipped across the courtyard. Guards shielded their faces. Robb clutched the spines, feeling a flutter in his stomach as they rose. The motion was not as smooth as before. The left wing faltered slightly, struggling for lift. But Rhaegal managed to ascend, clearing the walls of Raventree Hall in a swirl of startled cries from watchers on the ramparts. They hovered above the castle, swirling once around the courtyard below. Men pointed, half in awe, half in alarm. Robb felt his pulse quicken at the old exhilaration of flight, yet he also sensed Rhaegal's strain. The dragon's breathing came rough, and each wing beat felt labored. "Back down," Robb said softly, guiding with a shift of weight. "That's enough." Rhaegal obeyed, gliding in a tight spiral before landing heavily in the courtyard. The impact jarred Robb's bones. He slid off, then laid a hand on Rhaegal's shoulder, feeling the creature's labored, panting. A pang of concern gripped him. For all the miracle of their bond, Rhaegal was not yet battle-ready. "Another few weeks," Maester Conran said, hurrying forward to check on the dragon. "The wing joint is still tender. If we push it, the wound could tear open again." Robb exhaled. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience. Without the dragon's full might, a direct confrontation with Tywin in a fortified position might be madness. Better to wait and let the wing heal. So he settled into a routine. Each day he coordinated with Titos's steward for supplies, oversaw hunts, managed ravens to maintain contact with the Tullys and the other riverlord. He arranged for those men well enough to ride to patrol the region. He had the Great John lead a small force westward to harass any Lannister outriders, but with orders to avoid a pitched battle. The nights were long and restless. Sleeping in a borrowed chamber at Raventry Hall, Robb often woke drenched in cold sweat, haunted by fleeting nightmares of Tywin's cunning gaze, or the Red Wedding's horrors. Sometimes he dreamed of Daenerys Targaryen, standing amid swirling ash, demanding her dragon's return, while an army of unsullied leveled spears at the gates. Other nights, he dreamed of Grey Wind's eyes, bright with sorrow, or his father's silent face. He would rise before dawn, heart pounding, and go to the courtyard to find Rhaegal, as though seeing the dragon's real, solid form could dispel the phantoms that plagued his sleep. The lordlings who had followed him began to grow restless as well. They asked each day if it was time to march on Tywin, time to retake the west, or at least cripple the Lion's domain, so that the north could be free of future threats. Robb reminded them each time that Rhaegal was not fully healed, that marching in mid-autumn to besiege a Lannister fortress was folly. Deep down, though, he worried that Tywin was mustering strength while they waited. Another wave of ravens brought word that Tywin's allies had begun to gather near Ashmark and the Crakehall lands. Perhaps it was rumor, but it gnawed at Robb's mind. Nearly 2 weeks after their arrival at Raventry Hall, Rhaegal's wing showed marked improvement. The scab had fallen away, leaving a tough new growth of scale around the tear. The dragon moved more easily, occasionally testing flight by hopping onto low structures within the courtyard. Each time, castle guards scrambled to avoid the swirl of dust. One day, Rhaegal even soared above the battlements for a short while, then landed without wincing. Hope stirred in Robb's chest. Soon they might risk a real flight, one that could carry them westward to scout Tywin's movements personally, or even lay waste to any new Scorpion emplacements. But on the very evening that Robb began discussing a departure with his lords, a rider galloped through Raventry's gates, nearly tumbling off his horse in exhaustion. He wore the sigil of House Reed and carried a satchel filled with letters. Robb recognized him faintly as a courier in service to Greywater Watch. The man gasped for breath, calling Robb's name until he was guided inside and offered water. When he finally caught his breath, he pressed a missive into Robb's hands. "Urgent news, Your Grace," he rasped. This was carried from the neck by way of a chain of riders. "It bears your sister's seal." Robb's heart lurched. His sister. Sansa remained at Winterfell, as far as he knew. Arya's fate was uncertain. Bran and Rickon were gone, lost if not dead. It had to be from Sansa. He broke the seal with trembling fingers, scanning the neat script. At first his eyes darted too quickly to absorb the words. He forced himself to slow, reading carefully. "My dearest brother, I pray this finds you in good health. Winterfell stands, though the cold grows harsh. I write with troubling tidings. Rumors abound that Daenerys Targaryen has landed in the Vale with her forces, forging some kind of pact with Lord Nestor Royce. I do not know the extent of her power, but the stories speak of thousands of unsullied and 2 remaining dragons. They say she seeks to unite the realm against further Lannister rule, but also that she demands loyalty to her rightful claim on the Iron Throne. If she learns that one of her dragons resides with you, she may view it as theft or betrayal. I cannot say. Please be cautious. If Daenerys is in the Vale, she could move north or south at will. Lord Royce is no fool, and the Erie's defenses are strong. Mother once told me that the Vale was near impregnable in winter. Perhaps the Targaryen queen believes it an ideal foothold. I fear what might happen if your paths cross under strange circumstances. The North cannot endure another war. I trust in your wisdom, dear brother, and hope the gods guide you. Your loving sister, Sansa. Robb read and reread the letter, the words pounding in his mind. Daenerys Targaryen, in the Vale, potentially allied with House Royce. If this was true, she might be a mere few weeks' march from the Neck, or from Winterfell itself. He glanced at Rhaegal in the courtyard, feeling a cold sweat break along his brow. Though he had always known she might come one day, to hear that she was so close made his stomach clench. Your Grace, the courier ventured, voice shaky. Have you news for Lady Sansa? Robb realized he was clutching the parchment too tightly, nearly crumpling it. He let out a slow breath. Yes, he said at last. You'll rest, then return north with my reply. I must consider carefully what to write. The courier bowed, relief washing over his face as castle servants led him away to food and shelter. Robb stood in the hall, mind whirling. Tywin Lannister to the west, Daenerys Targaryen to the east, or north, or south, depending on how she moved. Two lions in a sense, if one counted the Targaryen dragon as a lion's rival. And in the midst of this, the battered north, clinging to alliance with a single wounded dragon of its own. He summoned the Greatjon, Karstark, and the other lords at once, reading them Sansa's letter. Alarm rippled through the group. They debated the possible intentions of Daenerys. Some believed she might come as an ally, seeing the Lannisters as a mutual enemy. Others warned that the Targaryens had always claimed absolute dominion over the Seven Kingdoms, and Robb's claim to the north might stand in her way, especially if he held one of her dragons. As they argued, Robb rubbed his temple. The path forward branched dangerously. Chase Tywin west, or risk that Daenerys might march from the Vale toward the north, attempt an alliance with her, or prepare for conflict. He glanced through the window where Rhaegal's silhouette loomed in torchlight against the old weirwood. That single image reminded him that the realm was a place of shifting powers, ancient loyalties, and long memories. The slightest misstep could condemn them all. Enough, Robb said firmly, halting the argument swirling around him. We can't make hasty decisions. We'll send a raven to the Vale if possible, offer to parley. We share a common enemy in the Lannisters. Perhaps we can settle matters peacefully. But we won't ignore Tywin. If we leave him unchecked, he could strike us in the back while we negotiate with Daenerys. Menderoso. The Greatjon scratched his beard. Does your sister mention any northern lords supporting the Targaryen girl? She doesn't say, Robb replied. But the Vale is near the north, and Sansa says the queen has 2 dragons with her. That's a fearsome force, especially with the Unsullied rumored to be unstoppable in open battle. We cannot face her if she's hostile and Tywin at the same time. Nadine? Karstark's expression hardened. Then we must hope she's willing to talk, because if it comes to flames she'll have as many dragons as you, plus an army behind her. We're in no shape for that. Not yet. The group fell silent, each man sifting through the implications. Finally, Robb drew himself upright. We'll remain here a bit longer. Let Rhaegal heal fully. We'll gather more intelligence. Then we decide which road to take, west to face Tywin, or east to negotiate with Daenerys. One misstep could doom us. Lannister. Some nodded, though anxious murmurs lingered. The council dissolved with heavy hearts, returning to their tasks, or slipping away to brood over the letter's contents. Robb left them, stepping outside into the courtyard, where a chill wind rustled the dead branches of the ancient weirwood. Rhaegal watched him approach, tilting its head in curiosity. The dragon's golden eyes reflected the flicker of nearby torchlight. Robb placed a hand on Rhaegal's flank, the warmth seeping through his glove. The beast's breath rumbled, blowing strands of Robb's hair across his forehead. He met the dragon's gaze, remembering the day he had tended Rhaegal's wounds in that lonely forest clearing. How improbable it had seemed that a Stark and a dragon might form any bond. Now the realm might be on the brink of seeing 2, perhaps 3 dragons taking the skies against one another, each driven by a different cause. The notion filled him with dread, He bent closer, speaking softly. "I won't let them take you without a fight," he promised, though a thread of uncertainty laced his voice. "You're free, as far as I'm concerned. But if Daenerys sees it differently..." He trailed off. Rhaegal's answer was only a low growl, a lazy flick of its tail. For a moment, Robb imagined a scenario in which he, Daenerys, and their dragons joined forces to crush Tywin once and for all, then set about reordering the realm. Could it be that simple? Likely not. The Targaryen queen had every reason to mistrust him if she saw him as a usurper or a thief of her dragon. The North had fought for independence, and the Targaryens had always insisted on the unity of the Seven Kingdoms under their crown. Robb let out a shuddering breath. The war had taught him how fragile alliances could be, how swiftly betrayal could strike. He glanced up at the swirling stars overhead. Each one winked, cold and distant. He tried to recall the warmth of the Godswood at Winterfell, the sense of quiet certainty he once had when kneeling before the heart tree. Those days felt far behind him. In the hush of the courtyard, he knelt beside Rhaegal's flank, letting the dragon's rumbling breaths lull him. Another storm was gathering on the horizon. Tywin in the west, Daenerys in the east. Winter fast approaching. He could almost hear his father's voice, telling him to hold true, to guard the north above all else. But the ghosts of the past offered no simple answers, only the resolve to endure whatever came. He bowed his head, acknowledging the gathering darkness that threatened to consume the realm once more. But in that moment, Rhaegal's side rose and fell beneath his palm, a tangible reminder of the fire they now possessed. If he could wield it wisely, if he could find a path to peace with Daenerys, then perhaps the North and all of Westeros might stand a chance of surviving the trials yet to come. Guarding that fragile hope, Robb remained by the dragon's side, prepared to face the swirling uncertainties that lay beyond the walls of Raventree Hall.